In July of 1995, a worker named Klaus was walking across the floor of a massive gravel quarry in Kirpen, Germany. The ground beneath his heavy work boots should have been solid, packed stone and silt. He felt a rhythmic, low-end thumping travel up through his soles and into his shins. It was not the machinery of the pit, because the machines were silent for the afternoon break. The vibration was coming from deep inside the earth, steady and deliberate, like a heart beating through the stone. Klaus stopped walking and stood perfectly still, waiting to see if his mind was playing tricks on him in the heat. It was the kind of movement that did not belong in a place of dead rock. He knelt down, pressing his gloved hand against the dust, and felt it again. It was a physical pulse, deep and resonant, as if something massive was trying to breathe beneath 10 meters of gravel. The air in the quarry was hot and still, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway. Klaus looked around at the towering walls of the pit and felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease. He knew every inch of this industrial site, and there was nothing buried here that should be moving. Tonight, I have 13 true stories that explore what happens when the world we think we know is hollowed out and replaced by something far darker. We are going from the industrial pits of Europe to the high-security diamond fields of Africa. We will be listening to the rain tonight, so find a quiet place and settle in. If you enjoy these kinds of strange, dark, and mysterious stories told slowly, hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. As for the like button, treat it like a stranger standing on a dark highway offering you a ride in his trunk. Just give it a polite, firm tap and keep moving. All right, check the locks, dim the lights, settle in, listen to the rain, and let's head back to that gravel pit in Kirpen. Thomas S. was a young man who valued order and the quiet rhythms of a productive life. He lived in a small, tidy apartment in Kirpen, where the windows looked out over the flat, green fields of North Rhine-Westphalia. He spent his mornings checking shipping manifests for his father, a man who had built a successful investment and logistics firm through decades of hard work. Thomas was not just the boss's son, he was the one who stayed late to help the warehouse staff secure their loads before the long hauls. He was 23 years old and possessed a certain gentleness that made people trust him almost instantly. On weekends, he would take his mountain bike out to the wooded trails near the quarry, enjoying the way the wind felt against his face. He was a creature of habit, stopping at the same local bakery every morning for a crusty roll and a black coffee. The woman behind the counter always knew his order before he even reached the door, and they would exchange a few words about the weather or the local soccer scores. Thomas had a vision for his future that was clear and bright, built on a foundation of loyalty. He wanted to eventually take over the family business, not for the status, but to honor the legacy his father had started from nothing. He was saving every cent he could from his salary to surprise his girlfriend with an engagement ring. He had already picked it out, a simple gold band with a small, clear stone, which he kept hidden in a velvet box inside his nightstand. In the evenings, he would often sit with his father on the back porch, discussing the shifting markets and the complexities of international trade. They were close, sharing a bond that went beyond business, rooted in mutual respect. His father saw in Thomas a steady hand and a sharp mind that would carry the family name forward. The world felt stable and predictable to him, a series of logistics problems that could always be solved with enough patience and a little bit of effort. Thomas was the kind of person who remembered his mother's favorite flowers and never missed a Sunday lunch. He was a pillar of his small social circle, the one his friends called when they needed a ride or a level-headed piece of advice. His life was a collection of small kindnesses and steady progress, a trajectory that pointed toward a long and peaceful career. There was no room in his world for chaos, and certainly no room for the kind of darkness that was quietly watching him from the shadows. He spent his free time reading history books and dreaming of the trip he wanted to take to the Swiss Alps. He loved the idea of the mountains, the high, thin air, and the absolute silence of the peaks. Thomas often talked about how much he appreciated the stillness of the countryside after a long day in the noisy warehouse. He found comfort in the predictable sounds of his neighborhood, like the distant ringing of church bells or the evening birds in the hedges. His father's business associates often commented on how much Thomas reminded them of his father in his younger years. He had the same focused stare and the same way of leaning forward when he was listening to someone speak. He was a young man who took life seriously, but he always had a quick, genuine smile for the people who worked under him. They respected him because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself, including the heavy lifting. On a Tuesday in late June, the air was thick with the scent of mown grass and the promise of a warm summer evening. Thomas left the office at 5 o'clock, waving a casual goodbye to the security guard as he stepped out into the parking lot. He climbed into his silver sedan, thinking about the dinner he was supposed to have with his parents that night. He was looking forward to his mother's roast chicken and the quiet, familiar conversation that always followed their meals. He adjusted his rearview mirror and pulled out onto the main road, humming a song he had heard on the radio. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement as he drove toward the transit station. He had planned to drop off a few documents at a satellite office before heading home to change for dinner. It was a perfect, ordinary afternoon in a life that was just beginning to take its final, adult shape. Thomas liked the way the city looked in this light, the old brick buildings glowing with a soft, orange warmth. He felt a sense of deep contentment, a feeling that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He pulled into the parking lot of the transit station and turned off the engine, reaching for his briefcase on the passenger seat. The world outside was busy with commuters, and the sound of distant traffic was a comforting, steady hum in the background. When Thomas did not show up for dinner at 7 o'clock, his mother initially felt a small flicker of annoyance. She assumed he had been caught up in a late meeting or had simply forgotten to check the time while working at the warehouse. But by 8 o'clock, the annoyance had turned into a cold, sharp knot of worry in her chest. Thomas was never late, and he never left a phone call unreturned, especially when it came to family obligations. His father drove to the transit station and found Thomas's silver sedan parked exactly where it should have been. The car was locked, but the keys were still dangling in the ignition, and his briefcase was sitting on the front seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no footprints in the dirt to suggest he had been taken by force. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the car and evaporated into the warm evening air. The police arrived and cordoned off the area, but they found nothing that could explain the disappearance of a healthy young man in broad daylight. They interviewed the commuters and the station staff, but no one remembered seeing anything unusual. Thomas's bank accounts remained untouched, and his passport was still in his desk drawer at home. For the next several weeks, the investigation hit a stone wall, and the case of the missing logistics clerk slowly began to grow cold. Back in the gravel quarry, Klaus, the maintenance worker, was staring at a patch of ground that didn't look right. He had followed the vibration to a decommissioned ventilation shaft that had been out of use for over a decade. The metal grate at the top of the shaft had been replaced with a heavy, bolted steel plate that was painted to match the surrounding stone. It was a professional job, designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. Klaus called for his supervisor, and together they used a crowbar to pry the heavy plate away from the mouth of the shaft. As the seal broke, a blast of stale, metallic air hit them, followed by a sound that made both men take a step back. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help, but a high-pitched, electronic squeal that seemed to vibrate in their very teeth. They looked down into the darkness, but the shaft was 10 meters deep and lined with something black and textured. They lowered a high-powered flashlight on a rope, and the beam revealed a horrifying modification of the industrial space. The interior of the concrete pipe had been lined with thick layers of acoustic foam and heavy sheets of lead. At the very bottom, curled into a tight ball, was a human figure dressed in tattered clothing. The person was not moving, and the flashlight beam showed that their hands were pressed tightly over their ears, as if trying to block out the world. The rescue operation took 4 hours of delicate work to ensure the shaft didn't collapse under the weight of the heavy machinery. You are standing at the bottom of a 10-meter shaft, and the air is thick with the smell of wet lead and static. The walls are soft to the touch, covered in foam that swallows every sound except for the piercing, rhythmic electronic noise. It is a space designed to isolate the human mind from every possible sensory input except for one. The technicians discovered that the pipe had been turned into a sophisticated sensory deprivation and sound torture chamber. A set of high-output speakers had been mounted into the lead lining, wired to a complex series of car batteries hidden in a nearby drainage culvert. These batteries were connected to a small, disguised solar panel that had been mounted on a rocky ledge above the quarry. It was a self-sustaining system, designed to run for months without any human intervention. The speakers were not playing music or voices, but a constant, looping frequency of 90 decibel white noise. It was a sound designed to shatter the ability to think, a relentless wave of pressure that hammered against the eardrums every second of every day. The lead lining ensured that no sound from the victim could escape the pipe, and no sound from the outside world could get in. It was a silent tomb where the only thing that existed was the noise. The investigators found a small, hidden compartment near the solar panel that contained a professional-grade radio transmitter and a timer. The perpetrator had used these tools to adjust the frequency of the noise from a distance, ensuring the victim never grew accustomed to the sound. It was a calculated, clinical approach to psychological warfare, executed with the precision of an engineer. The level of technical skill involved suggested someone who understood exactly how to break a human being without ever touching them. The only reason the chamber had been discovered was a freak afternoon rainstorm that had occurred 2 days prior. The heavy runoff had flooded the drainage culvert, causing the battery casing to short-circuit and fail. This failure had altered the frequency of the electronic loop, dropping it from a high-pitched squeal to the low-frequency thumping that Klaus had felt through his boots. If it had not rained, the system would have continued to run in total silence for the rest of the summer. I have seen how a man can be broken not by what he sees, but by what he is forced to hear. The recovery team finally reached the bottom of the shaft and carefully placed the victim onto a stretcher. It was Thomas S., but he was unrecognizable as the vibrant young man who had disappeared 40 days earlier. His hair had turned a shock of white. His skin was the color of wet paper, and his eyes were wide and vacant, staring at a point miles beyond the concrete walls. When they brought him to the surface, Thomas did not react to the sunlight or the voices of his rescuers. He remained in a fetal position, his muscles locked in a state of permanent tension from weeks of crouching in the darkness. A thin trickle of blood ran from both of his ears, where the constant acoustic pressure had ruptured the delicate membranes. He made no sound as they loaded him into the ambulance, his mouth moving silently as if he were trying to remember how to form a word. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics tried to speak to him, but Thomas only flinched at the sound of their voices. To him, any sound was now a threat, a physical blow that caused his entire body to shudder with terror. He wondered, for a split second, if the world above had simply stopped existing, and if these people were just another part of the electronic loop. His mind had been hollowed out by the noise, leaving behind a shell that could no longer process reality. The investigation into the perpetrator led the police back to Thomas's father and his complicated history in the investment world. They focused on a man named Dieter, a former business partner who had lost everything in a failed logistics venture years earlier. Dieter was a hobbyist radio operator and a trained electrical engineer who had blamed Thomas's father for his financial ruin. He hadn't wanted to kill the man. He had wanted to take away the thing the father valued most in the world. Dieter had spent months watching Thomas, learning his habits, and scouting the abandoned quarry for the perfect location. He had built the lead-lined pipe in the dead of night, transporting the materials piece by piece so as not to draw attention. He had abducted Thomas at the transit station by using a localized EMP device to stall the car, then posing as a helpful mechanic. Once Thomas was incapacitated, he was lowered into the shaft and the steel plate was bolted shut. The police found a journal in Dieter's home that detailed the experiment in chilling, clinical language. He had calculated exactly how many days of 90 decibel noise it would take to erase the neural pathways responsible for language and memory. He didn't view himself as a murderer, but as an artist of psychological reconstruction. He wanted Thomas to return to his father as a blank slate, a living reminder of the debt Dieter felt he was owed. Dieter was arrested without incident and eventually sentenced to 12 years in a high-security prison for kidnapping and grievous bodily harm. During the trial, he remained completely silent, refusing to look at the family he had destroyed. The court heard testimony from acoustic experts who described the pipe as one of the most efficient torture devices ever constructed by a private citizen. The judge called the crime an act of calculated cruelty that bordered on the inhuman. Thomas S. underwent years of intensive neurological rehabilitation, but the damage to his brain was permanent and profound. He regained the ability to walk and perform basic tasks, but the high-frequency noise had permanently altered his ability to process human speech. To Thomas, the sound of a voice often sounds like a distorted, metallic scratching that is painful to endure. He lives in a specialized care facility where the rooms are soundproofed and the environment is kept in a state of absolute artificial quiet. 2026 finds Thomas S. in his early 50s, living a life of profound isolation in a small town near the border. He remains partially deaf and suffers from chronic vertigo and a form of post-traumatic stress that is triggered by even the smallest electronic hum. The perpetrator, Dieter, was released from prison over a decade ago and has since disappeared from the public record. The logistics company owned by Thomas's father was sold long ago. As the man could no longer bear to look at the manifests his son once checked so diligently. The gravel quarry in Kirpen was eventually filled in, and the land was reclaimed by the local government for a new development project. The ventilation shaft is gone, buried under tons of fresh earth, and paved over by a new access road. But local workers still talk about the whisperer of the pit, and some claim that on very quiet nights, you can still feel a faint vibration in the ground. It is a reminder that some wounds to the mind are so deep that the earth itself refuses to forget them. The hum of the industrial quarry is a sound of progress and construction, but it can also be a mask for a much deeper silence. That silence is what waits for those who wander too far from the light, into the places where the air is thick with lead and secrets. As the vibration of the pit fades into the distance, we move toward a different kind of path. It is a long stretch of highway where the only thing waiting for a traveler is a throne made of thorns and a name they can no longer speak. On a Tuesday evening in April, 1996, the orange sun was sinking behind the low, flat hills of the Matabeleland countryside. Samuel, a 30-year-old construction laborer with dust-caked boots and a heavy canvas bag, stood by the edge of the narrow asphalt road connecting Bulawayo to Plumtree. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, watching the heat shimmers dance over the blacktop as the first cool breeze of the evening began to stir the dry grass. Samuel was not looking for trouble. He was simply looking for a way to get back to his village before the darkness became absolute and the predatory animals of the bush began their nightly patrol. He had spent the last 3 weeks working 12-hour shifts in the city, hauling bags of cement and laying bricks for a new government building that seemed to rise slower than the moon. Samuel was a man of immense physical strength, but his true power lay in his patience and his devotion to a family that lived nearly 80 kilometers away. Every cent he earned was tucked into a small weathered leather pouch hidden in the lining of his jacket, destined for school fees and a new corrugated iron roof for his mother's house. He was a son who remembered birthdays and a brother who always brought back small pieces of colorful rock or interesting seed pods for his younger siblings to play with. His life was measured in the rhythmic swing of a pickaxe and the steady progression of the seasons, a simple existence that he wore with a quiet, uncomplaining dignity. Samuel loved the smell of the rain on the dry earth and the way the shadows of the acacia trees lengthened across the sand during the golden hour. He was a man who knew the names of the birds and the tracks of the kudu, a person who felt more at home under the vast, starry sky than in the cramped, noisy corridors of the city. To him, the road was a bridge between the world of labor and the world of love, a path that he had walked and hitched 100 times without ever feeling a moment of true fear. He was known in his village as a peacemaker, the one who would sit and listen to both sides of an argument until the anger had cooled like the evening tea. Samuel had dreams of one day owning a small herd of cattle, a modest ambition that represented security and status in the land of his ancestors. He spent his long walks visualizing the curve of the horns in the low, comforting sound of the animals settling in the corral at night. This internal world was his sanctuary, a place where the exhaustion of the work week could be traded for the hopeful blueprints of a life he was building one brick at a time. His co-workers often marveled at his ability to remain cheerful even when the water was warm and the rations were thin. Samuel would simply smile, adjust his cap, and tell a joke that made the heavy lifting feel a little lighter for everyone within earshot. He was the human glue that held the work crew together, the one who noticed when a younger man was flagging and would quietly take over the hardest part of the job. He did not seek recognition or praise. He simply moved through the world with a sense of purpose that required no external validation from the people around him. That evening, the road felt unusually quiet, the traffic having thinned out as the workday ended and the light began to fail. Samuel checked the time on his cracked plastic watch and realized he had missed the last formal bus, leaving him with no choice but to wait for a private vehicle or a long-haul truck. He stepped a few feet into the tall, dry grass to clear a small space where he could sit and rest his back against a weathered milestones marker. The air was thick with the scent of wild sage and the distant, lonely call of a nightjar, a sound that usually brought him a sense of peace, but tonight felt strangely sharp. As the shadows grew long enough to touch the far side of the road, a military-style truck slowed down and pulled over onto the dusty shoulder a few dozen meters ahead of him. Samuel stood up quickly, brushing the red dust from his trousers and gripping his bag tightly, his heart lifting with the prospect of reaching home before midnight. The driver did not step out, but the engine remained idling with a low, rhythmic throb that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Samuel's boots. He walked toward the vehicle, his shadow stretching out like a long graph, thin finger pointing toward the dark silhouette of the driver behind the glass. 6 months later, a truck driver named Jabulani pulled his rig over near the 10-kilometer marker on that same stretch of road to inspect a hissing air brake line. The sun was just coming up, casting a harsh, flat light over the landscape that revealed every detail of the scrubland with a clinical, unforgiving clarity. Jabulani adjusted his cap and walked toward the rear of his trailer, but his eyes were drawn to a strange shape sitting in the middle of a dense thicket of acacia trees. It did not look like a fallen branch or a pile of discarded trash. It looked like a piece of deliberate, high-stakes architecture in a place where nothing was supposed to grow. He walked closer, his heavy boots crunching on the dry earth, and realized he was looking at a chair woven entirely from the razor-sharp, white-tipped branches of the acacia thorn. The construction was magnificent and terrifying, a high-back throne that had been built with a level of geometric precision that suggested hours of focused, patient labor. But it was the occupant of the throne that caused Jabulani to stop breathing for a long, agonizing second. A man was sitting perfectly upright in the center of the thorns, his back straight and his head tilted slightly forward as if he were deep in a state of silent, respectful meditation. The man was dressed in a construction worker's jacket and heavy trousers, but his skin had been bleached by the sun to the color of old parchment. He was dead, but he had not been dumped or hidden. He had been installed, presented to the world as if he were a king presiding over a kingdom of dust. Jabulani noticed that the thorns of the chair were curved inward, piercing the fabric of the man's clothes and the skin of his arms in 100 different places. It was a scene of such profound, organized stillness that it felt as though the entire world had been frozen in a single, ritualistic moment of absolute judgment. Police investigators from Bulawayo arrived 2 hours later, their boots sinking into the soft sand as they circled the acacia throne with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep, visceral dread. They found that the victim's hands were resting on the armrests of the thorn chair. His fingers curled naturally around the sharpest points of the branches. There were no signs of a struggle in the dirt surrounding the site. No footprints other than the victim's own leading to the chair, and no blood on the ground. The scene was as clean as a museum exhibit, a masterclass in the art of making a disappearance look like a deliberate, voluntary transition into the afterlife. One of the younger officers knelt down to examine the victim's face and let out a soft, sharp gasp that drew the attention of the lead detective. Protruding from the dead man's mouth, tucked neatly between his lips like a final, dry wafer, was a green national identity card. The photo on the card showed a smiling, younger version of the man in the chair, a face full of life and the simple hope of a future that had been cut short. The card was perfectly clean, devoid of any fingerprints or dirt, placed there with the kind of obsessive care that suggested a deeper, more symbolic meaning. The identification confirmed that the man was Samuel, the laborer who had vanished months earlier on his way home to his village. His leather pouch was still hidden in the lining of his jacket, and the money he had earned for his mother's roof was still inside, untouched and neatly folded. This was not a robbery, and it was not a crime of passion. It was something far more calculated and cold. The killer had not wanted Samuel's money or his belongings. He had wanted his identity, his very status as a citizen of the state, returned to him in the most mocking way possible. Over the next few weeks, the investigation uncovered a horrifying pattern that suggested the road had become the personal gallery of a highly disciplined predator. 4 more bodies were found along the same 10-kilometer stretch, each sitting in an identical acacia throne, each with their national ID card placed in their mouth. The victims were all men, all hitchhikers, and all people who occupied the lower rungs of the social ladder: laborers, farmhands, and unemployed travelers. They were the invisible people of the highway, the ones whose absence might not be noted by the authorities for weeks or even months at a time. The medical examiner determined that each man had died from a single, massive blow to the back of the neck, delivered with a precision that suggested formal training in hand-to-hand combat or the use of a specialized tool. There were no other marks on the bodies, no signs of torture, and no evidence that the victims had tried to flee. It was as if they had been incapacitated instantly and then moved to the site where their thrones were waiting for them. The killer was not just a murderer. He was a craftsman who viewed the human body as a raw material to be shaped and displayed according to a very specific set of rules. The most chilling discovery came when the forensic team analyzed the defensive wounds on the victim's hands and arms. They realized that the acacia thrones had not been built before the murders. They had been woven around the victims while they were still alive, but unable to move. The killer had spent hours in the dark, kneeling in the dirt, carefully bending and tying the razor-sharp branches around the breathing, conscious bodies of his prey. You are sitting in the absolute silence of the bush, unable to scream or move, watching as a pair of steady hands slowly builds a cage of thorns around your heart. The level of discipline required to execute such a task was staggering, as the acacia thorn is notorious for its ability to catch and tear at everything it touches. Yet, the chairs were constructed with a fluid, artistic grace that showed no signs of hesitation or frustration on the part of the builder. The killer had mastered the environment, turning the very vegetation of the roadside into a weapon of psychological and physical entrapment. He was someone who knew how to work with his hands, someone who understood the limits of human endurance and the terrifying power of a slow, methodical approach to death. I have spent a long time thinking about the hands that wove those thorns, hands that never shook and never left a single trace of their own skin behind. The police began to look toward the local military outposts and the ranks of the former Rhodesian-era soldiers who still lived in the area. They suspected a man with a background in unconventional warfare, someone who viewed the post-independence identity of the nation with a sense of bitter, ritualistic contempt. The placement of the ID cards felt like a political statement, a way of saying that these men were nothing more than the plastic cards they carried in their pockets. The investigation focused on a specific 10-kilometer zone that the locals had begun to call the Executioner's Path, a stretch of road where people refused to stop for any reason. Despite the increased patrols and the deployment of plainclothes officers acting as hitchhikers, the Roadside King remained a ghost in the landscape. He knew the patrol schedules. He knew the blind spots of the highway. And he knew exactly how to move through the bush without leaving a single footprint. He was a shadow that operated in the space between the headlights, a predator who was always one step ahead of the people hunting him. The local population was paralyzed by a fear that was as dry and sharp as the thorns themselves, a terror that changed the way they moved through their own land. People who had walked those roads for decades now huddled in groups, and the sound of an approaching vehicle was no longer a sign of hope, but a signal to hide in the tall grass. The economy of the roadside stalls collapsed, and the vibrant life of the highway was replaced by a heavy, watchful silence that seemed to vibrate with the memory of the men in the thrones. The killer had successfully claimed the road, turning a public artery into a private, ritualistic graveyard. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun in early 1997, leaving the police with a collection of cold files and a set of gruesome photographs. There were no more thrones, no more ID cards, and no more bodies left in the sun to judge the passing travelers. The investigation eventually faded into the background as the country moved into a period of intense regional unrest and economic shifting. It was theorized that the killer had died in the fighting, moved across the border into South Africa, or simply decided that his message had been delivered with enough clarity to satisfy his dark, internal logic. The acacia thrones were eventually dismantled by the elements or burned by locals who wanted to erase the physical memory of the Roadside King from their horizon. But the stories of the men who sat in the thorns remained, a dark folklore that was passed down in the villages near Bulawayo and Plumtree. They talked about Samuel and the four others, not as victims of a simple crime, but as participants in a ritual that no one truly understood. The road remained, a long black ribbon cutting through the red earth, but it carried a weight that the asphalt could never truly support. 2026 finds the stretch of road between Bulawayo and Plumtree as a cold case that officially remains open but is functionally dead. The files are kept in a dusty archive in the city, the pages yellowed and the ink fading on the names of the men who never made it home. There has been no new evidence, no DNA matches from the newer regional databases, and no deathbed confessions from the aging soldiers of the bush. The Roadside King is likely an old man now, or a skeleton in an unmarked grave, his secrets buried under the same red dust that once coated Samuel's boots. The acacia trees still grow thick along the highway, their white thorns catching the morning light and casting long, sharp shadows across the sand. Travelers today drive quickly through that 10-kilometer stretch, their eyes fixed on the road ahead and their doors locked against the ghosts of the past. They do not stop for hitchhikers, and they do not look too closely into the thickets of thorns that line the shoulder. The memory of the thrones is a part of the landscape now, a reminder that the world can be a beautiful place, provided you never have to sit down and truly look at what is growing in the dark. The ritual of the road is a story of how a single person can turn a path of connection into a corridor of absolute, calculated isolation. It is a reminder that the things we carry to define who we are can be the very things a predator uses to mark our end. As the dry wind of the bush fades into the distance, we move toward a different kind of architecture, one built of stone and wires. It is a house in the heart of France where the walls have eyes, and the comfort of a private room is nothing more than an elaborate, high-tech illusion. In the spring of 1995, a plumbing contractor named Mark was kneeling on the cold tile floor of a second-story bathroom in an elegant apartment building in Lyon, France. He was there to investigate a persistent, slow leak that had begun to discolor the plaster in the unit directly below. With a heavy hammer and a chisel, he began to carefully open a small section of the wall behind the pedestal sink, expecting to find a rusted copper pipe or a faulty joint. Instead, as the first chunk of plaster fell away, he saw something that made him put down his tools and reach for his heavy industrial flashlight. Pressed deep into the dark void between the inner lath and the outer stone of the 19th century building was a thick, glistening bundle of hair-thin wires. They were not electrical lines or telephone cables, but translucent threads of glass and plastic that seemed to pulse with a faint, artificial light. Mark reached into the wall and pulled at the bundle, realizing it was not just a handful of wires, but a massive nerve system that branched out in every direction. The threads ran vertically toward the ceiling and horizontally behind the ornate wainscoting, disappearing into the very structure of the building like a silent, hungry parasite. The apartment building sat on a quiet street in the heart of Lyon, a city where the history of the silk trade and the resistance still lived in the narrow, winding passageways. It was a place of high ceilings, tall windows, and thick limestone walls that suggested a level of privacy and permanence that few modern structures could offer. The tenants were mostly young professionals and students, people who valued the charm of the old world and the convenience of being close to the university. They moved through the grand lobby with a sense of belonging, greeting the elderly landlord with polite smiles and brief comments about the weather. Jacques was 70 years old, a soft-spoken man with a penchant for gray wool sweaters and a deep knowledge of French history. He was a former intelligence officer who had retired to manage the property he had inherited from his family, a task he performed with a quiet, meticulous efficiency. He was always available to fix a sticky door or replace a light bulb, often appearing at a tenant's door before they had even called to report a problem. To the 12 women who lived in the building, Jacques was a grandfatherly figure, a reliable anchor in a city that could sometimes feel impersonal and vast. One of these women was Claire, a 24-year-old architecture student who spent her evenings sketching at a small wooden desk by her bedroom window. She loved the way the lamplight hit the floral wallpaper of her unit, a pattern of pale roses that seemed to dance in the soft shadows of the evening. Claire often felt a deep sense of peace when she closed her heavy oak door and turned the iron key in the lock. The walls were so thick that she could never hear her neighbors, a silence that allowed her to drift into her work with total, uninterrupted focus. She had big dreams of restoring the old theaters of Paris, and her apartment was filled with rolls of drafting paper and boxes of charcoal. Claire was the kind of person who noticed the small details, like the way the floorboards creaked in a certain spot or the smell of lavender that seemed to drift through the vents on rainy days. She felt a connection to the history of the space, imagining the generations of people who had lived and breathed within these same four walls. Her life was a collection of quiet ambitions and steady progress, a trajectory that felt protected by the very stone of the building. Claire often shared coffee with the other women in the building, discussing their studies or their plans for the upcoming summer holidays. They all spoke highly of Jacques, noting how he seemed to take a special interest in their well-being without ever being intrusive. He would occasionally leave a small bouquet of flowers or a box of chocolates on their doorsteps for no reason at all. It was a community of trust, a small pocket of safety where the doors were often left unlocked while someone ran down to the corner bakery for a fresh baguette. However, in the months leading up to the plumber's arrival, a few of the women had begun to notice things that felt slightly out of alignment. A bottle of perfume would be on the left side of the vanity instead of the right, or a drawer would be pushed in just a fraction of an inch more than usual. These were tiny, inconsequential details that were easy to dismiss as the result of a long day or a lapse in memory. They were the kinds of things that only registered in the back of the mind, a soft whisper of doubt that was quickly drowned out by the noise of daily life. One tenant, a law student named Sophie, had received a strange piece of mail with no return address and a local postmark. Inside was a single, grainy photograph of her sleeping in her own bed, taken from an angle that seemed to be high up near the ceiling. She had shown it to Jacques, who had been deeply concerned and promised to install extra locks on the main entrance of the building. Sophie had eventually convinced herself it was a prank or a mistake, unable to reconcile the image with the absolute security of her third-floor apartment. When the police arrived at the building following the plumber's report, they were led by a detective who specialized in technical surveillance. They began to pull back the floral wallpaper in Claire's bedroom and found a series of microscopic holes drilled through the plaster with surgical precision. Inside each hole was a fiber optic lens, no larger than the head of a pin, angled to capture every corner of the room. There were thousands of them, hidden behind the eyes of painted birds, inside the centers of roses, and even tucked into the dark crevices of the crown molding. The investigation moved with a cold, clinical speed as the officers traced the wires down through the skeleton of the building. They found that the fiber optics converged in a central trunk that ran through a hidden shaft behind the main elevator. This trunk did not go to the street or the telephone exchange, but deeper into the earth, beneath the foundation of the 19th century structure. It led to a sub-basement that was not listed on any of the original architectural plans, a space that was accessible only through a hidden lift in Jacques' private library. You are standing in a room with no windows, where the air is cool and smells of ozone and old paper. The walls are lined with dozens of small, flickering monitors, each one showing a different angle of a private life happening just a few meters above your head. You can see a woman brushing her hair, another reading a book, and a third stepping out of a shower, all unaware that their most intimate moments are being projected into this dark, silent gallery. It is a space where the concept of home has been completely dismantled and replaced by a cold, electronic eye. The police discovered a viewing chair in the center of the room, a comfortable leather recliner that faced the wall of monitors like a throne in a private theater. On a nearby desk was a stack of leather-bound journals, one for each tenant, filled with thousands of pages of observations written in Jacques' neat, academic hand. He had recorded their sleep cycles, their phone conversations, the names of their visitors, and even the frequency of their breaths. He wasn't just watching them, he was cataloging their existences with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a colony of insects. The most horrifying discovery was made behind a heavy, soundproof steel door at the back of the sub-basement. Inside was a small, windowless unit that had been furnished to look exactly like the apartments upstairs, complete with identical wallpaper and furniture. But there were no locks on the inside of the door, and the light could only be controlled from the viewing room. The police found evidence that at least 12 women had been kept in this guest room for weeks at a time over the last 20 years. They had been abducted from their own beds and moved through the hidden lift, while the rest of the world believed they had simply moved away. Jacques was arrested in his library, sitting in his gray wool sweater with a book of poetry open on his lap. He did not struggle or protest his innocence. He simply watched the officers with a calm, intellectual detachment that was more terrifying than any outburst. He spoke about his tenants not as people, but as subjects in a lifelong study of human behavior under the pressure of the unknown. He had used his intelligence training to turn a building into a psychological trap, believing that he was entitled to their lives because he provided them with a place to live. I have wondered if the most dangerous predators are not the ones who hide in the woods, but the ones who build the walls we live within. The trial in 1995 revealed that Jacques had systematically sabotaged the lives of his tenants to trigger psychological breakdowns. He would cut their power, move their belongings, or mail them anonymous photos to see how they would react to the perceived violation of their space. He viewed their terror as a data point, a way to measure the limits of the human mind when it can no longer trust its own surroundings. The perpetrator was sentenced to life in prison, but he only served 3 years before dying of natural causes in 1998. He remained unrepentant until the end, claiming that he had given his victims a level of attention that no one else in their lives ever would. The building in Lyon was eventually gutted, and every inch of the wiring was pulled from the walls and destroyed. The microscopic holes were filled with fresh plaster, and the floral wallpaper was replaced with a modern, neutral paint that reflected the light of a new era. 2026 finds the apartment building fully occupied by a new generation of tenants who know the story only as a piece of local urban legend. Many of the original victims remain in long-term psychiatric care, unable to ever feel truly alone or secure in a room with a closed door. They suffer from a form of trauma that is rooted in the structural betrayal of their own homes, a wound that no amount of therapy can fully close. The building stands as a monument to a shadow that lived in the stone, a reminder that the eyes we cannot see are often the ones that are watching us the closest. The House of a Thousand Eyes is a story of how the architecture of our lives can be turned against us by a mind that values observation over empathy. It is a reminder that the feeling of being watched is sometimes more than just a trick of the nerves. It is the physical presence of a predator who has mastered the art of the invisible. As the lights of the Lion apartment fade into the gray morning, we move toward the delicate, white paper of a city in the east. It is a place where a girl is finding that her own image is being folded into a nightmare that she cannot escape. In February of 1995, the winter air in the Gion district of Kyoto was sharp enough to sting the skin. Ayumi, a 21-year-old apprentice in a traditional tea house, walked along the narrow stone paths of the Hanamachi. She held the hem of her heavy silk kimono, her wooden sandals making a rhythmic, hollow sound against the frozen ground. The street lamps cast long, amber shadows across the dark wood of the makiya houses. Ayumi moved with a practiced, upright posture, her face a pale mask of white makeup that glowed in the dim light. She was a woman who lived in the space between the modern world and 1,000 years of history. Ayumi had spent 3 years learning the delicate arts of conversation, dance, and the tea ceremony. She was not just a student, she was a vessel for a culture that valued silence and precision above all else. Her days began at dawn, practicing the placement of her fingers on the strings of a shamisen until they bled and calloused. She lived in a small, shared apartment on the 3rd floor of a weathered building near the Kamo River. Her room was sparse, smelling of tatami mats and the faint, sweet scent of incense that clung to her hair. Ayumi found comfort in the rigid structure of her life, the way every movement had a meaning and every silence had a weight. Her family lived in a small suburb of Osaka, and she sent them letters twice a month written in careful, elegant calligraphy. She told them about the tourists who visited the tea house and the cold beauty of the temples in the snow. Ayumi was the pride of her parents, a girl who had transformed herself into a living piece of art. She was a person of immense discipline, able to sit perfectly still for hours while her hair was styled into elaborate, gravity-defying shapes. The weight of the wig and the ornaments was a physical burden she wore with a quiet, uncomplaining grace. Ayumi believed that the struggle was a necessary part of the beauty she was trying to create. Her favorite time of day was the early morning when the mist still clung to the river and the city was quiet. She would walk to a small shrine near her apartment and leave a single coin, whispering a prayer for her family and her future. Ayumi felt a deep connection to the stone and the wood of Kyoto, as if the city itself were protecting her. She had a small circle of friends, other apprentices who understood the unique pressures of their chosen path. They would drink tea in their few hours of freedom, whispering about their dreams of one day becoming full geiko. Ayumi was the most promising among them, noted for her ability to listen with an intensity that made guests feel truly seen. Her life was a series of small, perfect gestures, from the way she poured sake to the way she folded her fans. Patience is a virtue in the arts, but in a predator, it is a form of slow-motion violence. Ayumi lived within the boundaries of tradition, never suspecting that someone was watching her from the edges of that world. She took great pride in her collection of silk obis, each one hand-painted with scenes of autumn leaves or spring blossoms. Ayumi would spend hours cleaning and organizing her belongings, finding a sense of control in the order of her small room. She was a young woman who believed that if she followed the rules, the world would remain stable. In her dreams, she saw herself performing on the great stages of Kyoto, the light catching the gold thread of her kimono. Ayumi looked at her own hands and wondered if they were becoming as fragile as the paper she used to practice her calligraphy. This flash of thought passed quickly, replaced by the immediate demands of her training and her duties. She was a pillar of her tea house, the one the older sisters relied on to handle the most difficult guests with a soft word. Ayumi never raised her voice and never showed frustration, a testament to the thousands of hours she had spent refining her character. She was a living ghost of a previous century, moving through a world of neon and glass. The first sign that the world was no longer predictable appeared in late March. Ayumi opened her locker at the tea house and found a tiny, perfectly folded paper crane sitting on top of her street clothes. It was made from a piece of old, yellowed newspaper, its wings sharp and its neck curved with an unnatural level of detail. She assumed it was a gift from a secret admirer or a small prank by one of the other girls. She placed the crane on her vanity. But the next day, there were 3 more. By the end of the week, the small paper birds had been replaced by a life-sized origami sculpture of a human hand, left on the threshold of her apartment. The paper hand was terrifyingly accurate, showing every crease of the knuckles and the curve of the fingernails. Ayumi felt a cold, sharp knot of unease in her chest as she picked it up. Realizing the paper was damp, she threw it in the trash. But the next evening, a paper foot was waiting for her, positioned as if it were stepping into her doorway. In early May, Ayumi returned home after a long night of entertaining guests at the tea house. The apartment building was silent. The only sound, the distant hum of a passing taxi on the main road. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her wooden sandals clicking softly on the concrete steps, and turned the key in her lock. As she stepped into her room, she saw a large, dark shape lying under the heavy silk duvet of her bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached out and pulled the covers back with a trembling hand. Lying on her pillow was a life-sized paper effigy of herself, constructed from hundreds of layers of discarded newspaper. The doll was wearing the silver earrings and the pearl necklace that Ayumi had reported missing from her jewelry box weeks earlier. It was a perfect, 1-to-1 scale reconstruction of her body, positioned in a natural, sleeping pose. The paper face was blank, yet it seemed to capture the very essence of her vulnerability in that moment. Ayumi fled the apartment and spent the night at the tea house, her mind a frantic blur of fear and confusion. The police were called the following morning, and they began a systematic search of the building and the surrounding neighborhood. They found no signs of forced entry, and the lock on Ayumi's door showed no evidence of tampering or picking. The forensic team analyzed the paper doll and found that it was held together by a mixture of rice, flour, and human saliva. The DNA from the saliva did not match anyone in the national database, and the fingerprints on the newspaper were smudged beyond recognition. The paper itself was traced to a defunct printing press in Osaka that had been closed since 1990. The investigation focused on the local art community and the paper mills of the region, looking for someone with the skill to create such a complex sculpture. They interviewed hundreds of people, but no one remembered seeing a man carrying large quantities of newspaper or acting suspiciously in the Gion district. The paper man remained a shadow that left no footprints. Ayumi returned to her apartment a week later, accompanied by a senior police officer who stayed in the unit next door. She had installed new, heavy-duty bolts on the door and iron bars on the windows, turning her sanctuary into a fortress. She stopped going to the tea house, too terrified to step out into the streets of the city she once loved. A neighbor in the building across the narrow alley was asked to monitor the only entrance to Ayumi's apartment around the clock. He was a retired man with a sharp eye for detail, and he kept a meticulous log of everyone who entered or exited the building. For 3 days, the hallway remained empty, and the only movement was the flickering of the hallway lights. On the night of May 14th, the neighbor reported that he saw Ayumi close her curtains at 10 o'clock as she did every evening. He watched the front door of the building until dawn, and he was certain that no one had entered or left during the night. The building was a closed system, a stone box under constant, unblinking surveillance. You are standing in a third-floor apartment where the windows are bolted shut and the only door is watched by a neighbor who never blinks. The air is still and heavy, with the scent of old newspaper and the faint, sweet smell of rice glue. There is no way out. And yet, there is a feeling that the very walls are beginning to fold inward. When the police officer checked on Ayumi the next morning, there was no answer to his knock. He used a master key to enter the apartment and found the room in perfect order. The tatami mats clean and the tea set sitting on the table. But the bed was empty, and the life-size paper doll was gone, leaving behind only a few scraps of torn newspaper. The window was still locked from the inside, and the heavy bolts on the front door were still engaged. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no evidence that anyone had been in the room other than Ayumi. She had vanished from a locked apartment on the third floor without a single witness or a single sound. The only clue was a small, perfectly folded paper crane left on the center of her pillow. It was made from a page of the local newspaper dated that very morning, a feat that seemed physically impossible given the timeline. The search for Ayumi continued for months, spanning the entire country, but she was never seen again. The investigation eventually uncovered a hidden crawlspace behind the communal laundry room in the basement. Inside, they found a nest of old newspapers and a collection of Ayumi's stolen belongings, including her favorite silk obi. The space was small and cramped, suggesting that the paper man was a person of slight build who could move through the walls like a ghost. The most disturbing discovery was a series of sketches found on the walls of the crawlspace, drawn in charcoal. They showed Ayumi in various stages of being folded, her limbs bent at impossible angles to fit into the geometry of a paper sculpture. The killer did not see her as a woman, but as a medium to be manipulated and reshaped. The case of the paper girl became a staple of Japanese urban legend, a story told to frighten apprentices who stayed out too late in the Gion. The police files remain open, but the physical evidence was lost in a mysterious fire that gutted the evidence locker in 1996. Some believe the fire was a final act by the stalker to erase the last traces of his work. 2026 finds Ayumi's name still on the list of the missing, a cold case that continues to haunt the Kyoto Prefectural Police. Her parents have long since passed away, never knowing the fate of the daughter they were so proud of. The tea house where she trained has been converted into a modern boutique, its history buried under layers of new paint and glass. The Gion district remains a place of beauty and tradition, but for those who know the story, the rustle of a newspaper in the wind carries a different meaning. People still leave small coins at the shrine near her old apartment, a silent tribute to the girl who became a living ghost. The paper man was never caught, and his identity remains the ultimate unsolved puzzle of the city. The delicate art of origami is a story of how something beautiful can be used to mask a profound and terrifying obsession. It is a reminder that the spaces we believe are secure can be breached by someone with enough patience and a total lack of empathy. As the paper rustles in the Kyoto wind, we move toward the heavy, wet soil of Sumatra. It is a place where a different kind of ritual is being performed in the dark, and the earth is preparing to swallow the innocent. In 1996, the midnight air over the outskirts of Medan was a thick, humid blanket that smelled of damp earth and rotting vegetation. 19-year-old Dewey stood at the edge of a vast sugarcane plantation, her feet sinking slightly into the soft, dark mud of the Indonesian coast. The moon was a sliver of silver behind the clouds, casting a weak, flickering light over the tall wife, jagged stalks of the cane that rattled in the warm wind. She was not there to work the fields, but to participate in a ritual that she believed would finally bring stability to her shifting, uncertain life. Dewey lived in a small, two-room house with her mother on the edge of the city, where the sound of the traffic was a constant, low-end hum. She spent her days working at a crowded market stall, selling bright fabrics and intricately woven baskets to the local villagers and the occasional tourist. Her hands were always stained with the colors of the dyes, and her back often ached from the long hours spent standing on the hard-packed dirt. Despite the physical toll, Dewey moved with a certain grace and a quick, genuine smile that made her a favorite among the regular customers. She was a young woman of simple, focused ambitions, rooted in a deep love for her family and a desire for a peaceful future. Dewey spent her meager savings on small gifts for her mother, like a tin of sweet biscuits or a new headscarf with a pattern of golden flowers. She dreamed of one day owning her own market stall, a place where she could display her own designs and perhaps even hire a few girls from the village to help her. Her life was a collection of quiet rhythms, from the morning prayer to the evening meal shared over a single kerosene lamp. Dewey had recently fallen in love with a young man from a neighboring district, a mechanic who spoke of moving to the capital to find better work. She felt a deep, gnawing anxiety that he would leave her behind, or that his heart would eventually wander to someone more sophisticated than a market girl. She wanted a charm, something powerful and ancient that would bind his heart to hers with the strength of the old traditions. Her friends had whispered about a man who lived nearby, a shaman who held the keys to the invisible world. This man was Ahmad Suraji, a well-respected figure in the community who was known as a Dukan, a traditional healer and practitioner of black magic. He lived in a modest house surrounded by a thriving sugarcane field, where he received visitors at all hours of the day and night. People came to him for everything from curing a persistent fever to seeking a blessing for a new business venture. Suraji was a man of quiet, deliberate movements, with eyes that seemed to see right through the physical world into the soul of the person sitting before him. Dewey had saved her earnings for 3 months to pay for a consultation with the Dukan, believing that his magic was her only chance at happiness. She finally made the journey to his house on a Tuesday morning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Suraji greeted her with a calm, reassuring voice, offering her a glass of cool water and listening with an intensity that made her feel deeply seen. He told her that her request was possible, but it required a ritual of absolute commitment and a willingness to surrender to the earth. He explained that the spirit of the sugarcane field was a powerful force of growth and attraction, and that she must be buried within its soil to absorb its energy. Dewey did not hesitate, her belief in the shaman's power overriding the small, cold voice of logic that whispered in the back of her mind. She saw him as a fatherly figure, a protector who was offering her a path out of her insecurity and into the light of a secure future. Suraji told her to return at midnight on the next full moon, bringing a white shroud and a small offering of gold. In the days leading up to the ritual, Dewey felt a strange sense of lightness, as if the burden of her worry had already been lifted. She was more attentive to her mother, spending hours talking about their childhood in the mountains and the stories their grandmother used to tell. She looked at her boyfriend with a new sense of confidence, believing that soon he would be hers forever. Her life felt like it was finally coming into a perfect, harmonious alignment, and she walked through the market with a secret, glowing strength. She spent her final evening at home cleaning the small house and preparing a special meal for her mother, a spicy fish curry that was their favorite. Dewey felt a deep sense of gratitude for the simple things in her life, even as she prepared to reach for something more. She looked at the gold earrings her father had given her before he died, the ones she would leave as an offering to the Dukan. Everything she had worked for and everything she loved seemed to be pointing toward this one, transformative moment in the dark. I have stood in places where the air felt like it was holding its breath, but the silence of a plantation at midnight is a different kind of heavy. You are standing in the center of a field where the sugarcane stalks rise like the walls of a labyrinth, their sharp leaves cutting at the air. The ground is soft and wet, the mud clinging to your ankles with a weight that feels like a physical pull toward the center of the earth. There is no sound of the city here, only the rhythmic, steady rasp of the cane in the wind. Suraji led Dewey to a clearing in the heart of the field, where a deep, narrow hole had already been dug into the dark soil. He told her to remove her outer garments and wrap herself in the white shroud, a symbol of her rebirth into a new, enchanted life. Dewey followed his instructions with a calm, rhythmic precision, her mind focused entirely on the image of the man she loved. She stepped into the hole, and the dukun began to pack the cold, wet mud around her waist, his movements steady and clinical. The weight of the earth was immense, pressing against her hips and stomach with a force that made it difficult to take a full breath. Suraji told her to remain perfectly still and to close her eyes, focusing her thoughts on the desire she wanted the earth to manifest. He spoke in a low, melodic chant, a language that Dewey did not understand, but that felt as old as the mountains themselves. The scent of fermenting sugarcane was overwhelming, a sickly smell that seemed to coat the inside of her throat and lungs. As the dukun continued his chant, he reached for a heavy, dark cable that was hidden in the long grass at the edge of the clearing. He did not look at Dewey's face, his expression remaining one of detached, professional focus as he moved behind her. The ritual was not about the girl, but about the power he believed he could harvest from her transition. Dewey remained silent, her eyes closed, believing that the sudden, tight pressure around her neck was simply the next stage of the magic that would change her life. In 1997, a local farmer named Ismail was walking his cattle near the edge of the Sperrgebiet plantation after a week of relentless, tropical rain. The storms had washed away the top layers of the soil, carving deep, jagged gullies into the sides of the hills and uncovering the secrets of the earth. Ismail noticed a pale, thin object protruding from the mud in a section of the field where the sugarcane had been cleared for a new harvest. He assumed it was a piece of white plastic or a discarded bag, but as he moved closer, he realized it was something else. It was a human hand. The fingers curled slightly inward as if they were trying to catch the falling rain. The skin was the color of gray slate, and the gold ring on the fourth finger glinted in the harsh, midday sun. Ismail felt a sudden, cold wave of nausea as he looked around the clearing and noticed more shapes emerging from the mud. They were heads and shoulders, all positioned at the same height, as if a small army of stone statues was being born from the dark, Sumatran soil. The local police arrived and began a systematic excavation of the field, a process that required the assistance of a military engineering unit due to the density of the mud. They uncovered 42 bodies over the course of 3 days, each one buried waist-deep in the earth. The victims were all young women, and they were all found in the same upright, seated position. The scale of the discovery was so vast that the investigators had to set up a temporary morgue in a nearby schoolhouse to handle the identification process. As the bodies were meticulously cleaned and examined, a chilling detail began to emerge that redefined the nature of the crime. Every single victim had been buried with their head pointing directly toward Ahmad Suraji's house, which sat on a small rise overlooking the field. It was as if the field were a giant, biological antenna, designed to funnel the spiritual energy of the dying women toward a single point of reception. The killer wasn't just hiding the bodies, he was using them as a source of power for his own dark ambitions. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death for all 42 women was the same manual strangulation using a heavy cable or cord. There were no other signs of violence on the bodies, and their clothing was intact, suggesting that the motive was entirely ritualistic rather than sexual. The victims had been buried while they were still alive and incapacitated, a fact that was confirmed by the presence of mud in their lungs and the defensive wounds on their hands. They had spent their final moments staring at the house of the man they had trusted to save them. Ahmad Suraji was arrested at his home, where he was found sitting on his porch, quietly drinking a cup of coffee. He did not attempt to flee, and he did not show any signs of remorse or surprise when the officers told him about the discovery in his field. He spoke with a calm, intellectual arrogance, explaining that he was a servant of a higher power that required a specific number of sacrifices. He believed that he was not a criminal, but a master of the invisible world who was entitled to the lives of those who sought his help. The investigation revealed that Suraji's 3 wives had been active participants in the killing spree, helping to manage the victims' schedules and cleaning their jewelry after the murders. They viewed their husband as a godlike figure whose commands were absolute and whose power was beyond question. The wives would often talk to the women as they waited for their rituals, reassuring them and making them feel at home while the dukun prepared the holes in the field. It was a family business built on the absolute betrayal of the most vulnerable members of their society. During his confession, Suraji stated that he had a dream in 1988 in which the ghost of his father appeared to him and told him to kill 70 women. He believed that by drinking the saliva of 70 dead women, he would be granted the power of ultimate healing and the ability to live for 1,000 years. He viewed the saliva as a physical manifestation of their life force, a liquid soul that he could consume to fortify his own. He was 42 souls into his goal when the rain finally uncovered his laboratory of death. The trial in Medan was a media circus that transfixed the nation, bringing to light the deep-seated regional beliefs in black magic and the power of the dukun. Suraji remained a figure of calm, cold mystery throughout the proceedings, often smiling at the families of the victims as they gave their heart-wrenching testimony. He spoke about the deaths as necessary steps in a spiritual evolution, a process that the court and the public were simply too limited to understand. He was a man who lived in a different reality, one where the earth was a tool and human life was a currency. The court sentenced Ahmad Suraji to death by firing squad, a verdict that was met with a mixture of relief and lingering horror by the community. His 3 wives were sentenced to life in prison for their roles in the conspiracy, a punishment they accepted with the same stoic detachment as their husband. The house and the plantation were seized by the state, and the sugarcane was burned to the ground in a massive, ritualistic fire that could be seen for miles across the lowlands of North Sumatra. 2026 finds the site of the sugarcane murders as a barren, gray scar on the landscape where nothing has grown for nearly 30 years. The local villagers avoid the area, claiming that the soil is permanently cursed and that the voices of the 42 women can still be heard in the wind at midnight. There have been several attempts to develop the land for agriculture or housing, but every project has failed due to unexplained equipment failures or a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread among the workers. The field is a dead zone, a physical reminder of a predator who hid behind a mask of spiritual guidance. Ahmad Suraji was executed in 2008, facing the firing squad with the same calm, unblinking stare that he had used on his victims. He died believing that his mission was incomplete, and that he would eventually return to finish the work he had started in the field. The families of the women, including Dewey's mother, have struggled to find peace, their lives forever defined by the hole that was left in their hearts. They continue to leave small offerings of flowers at the edge of the barren field, a silent tribute to the dreams that were buried in the mud. The Sorcerer's Field is a story of how faith can be weaponized by a mind that recognizes no boundaries and feels no empathy. It is a reminder that the people we look to for healing are sometimes the ones who are most prepared to harvest our lives for their own gain. As the heat of Sumatra fades into the evening shadows, we move toward the ancient stones of a city in the west. It is a place where a killer is carving a different kind of ritual into the flesh of the lost, using the blue of the sea to mark the end of the world. On a Tuesday morning in April 1995, a thin mist hung over the Bosphorus Strait, blurring the line between the cold water and the gray sky. A maritime police patrol moved slowly near the Maiden's Tower, the engine of the boat a low, rhythmic thrum in the quiet air. One officer, a man named Kerem, stood at the railing, sipping tea and watching the current swirl around the ancient stones of the lighthouse. He noticed something dark bobbing in the wake of a passing tanker, a shape that did not move like driftwood or a discarded tire. It was caught in a slow, circular eddy, rising and falling with a heavy, unnatural cadence that suggested a significant weight beneath the surface. Aras was 22 years old and possessed a pair of hands that were never still. He had arrived in Istanbul from a neighboring conflict with nothing but a small rucksack and a notebook filled with unfinished poems. In the early mornings, He worked at the sprawling fish markets of Kumkapi, his fingers numb from the ice as he sorted silver-scaled mackerel into wooden crates. He was a young man who moved with a quiet, careful economy, always aware of his status as a ghost in a city of millions. Aris did not speak much, but he listened to the rhythm of the city with the intensity of a man trying to memorize a symphony before the conductor stopped. He lived in a shared room in a crumbling apartment building in Tarlabasi, where the walls smelled of old tobacco and damp plaster. His bed was a thin pallet on the floor, but he kept it perfectly straight, the corners tucked in with a military precision he had learned from his grandfather. Aras spent his evenings at a small, cluttered desk, lit by a single bare bulb, trying to translate his thoughts into the language of his new home. He was a student of the world, a person who found beauty in the way the sunlight hit the copper domes of the mosques at sunset. He believed that if he worked hard enough and remained invisible enough, the city would eventually claim him as its own. Aras had a sister back across the border, a girl who loved the color blue and the sound of the wind in the mountain pines. Every month, he would walk to the central post office and send a small envelope filled with Turkish liras and a postcard showing the Bosphorus bridge at night. He promised her that one day they would walk across that bridge together, and he would buy her a silk scarf from the Grand Bazaar. This promise was the engine that drove him through the long, freezing nights on the docks and the lonely meals of bread and salted olives. He was a man built on a foundation of duty, a human pillar supporting a family he could no longer see. His co-workers at the market knew him as the boy who never complained, the one who would stay behind to hose down the concrete floors long after the others had gone to the tea houses. Aris found a strange sort of peace in the manual labor. The physical exhaustion, a shield against the memories of the fire and the screaming he had left behind. He was a person who appreciated the simple reality of things, like the weight of a fish in his palm or the cold bite of the morning air. To the world, he was just another refugee, a replaceable unit of labor in the vast machine of the city. But Aris felt himself to be a secret prince of the shadows. He often walked along the shoreline of the Bosphorus after his shift, watching the massive cargo ships move silently toward the Black Sea. He wondered about the people on those ships, where they were going and what they were leaving behind. Aris felt a deep, wordless connection to the water, a force that was both a border and a highway, a blue presence that defined the very soul of Istanbul. He would sit on the jagged rocks and write single lines of poetry on the backs of old receipts, letting the wind take the paper when he was finished. He was a man who understood that some things were meant to be transient, while others were etched into the stone. In the mid-afternoon, when the light turned a dusty gold, Aras would visit the small bookstores in the back alleys of Beyoğlu. He could not afford to buy anything, but the shopkeepers let him stand in the corners and read for hours, his tall, thin frame casting a long shadow over the shelves. He was a person of refined tastes, who happened to be living a life of raw necessity. Aris loved the feel of the paper under his fingertips, the physical weight of knowledge and history that seemed to vibrate in the air of the shops. He was a young man of deep intellect and untapped potential, a light hidden under a very heavy, industrial bushel. He had a habit of noticing the small, expensive details that other people ignored, like the quality of a man's shoes or the way a silver watch caught the light. Aras was a natural observer, a person who looked at the world through the lens of an artist even when his stomach was empty. He felt that there was a hidden logic to the city, a secret language spoken only by those who were willing to look closely at the edges. This sensitivity was his greatest gift and his most dangerous vulnerability, a bridge that connected his simple life to the complex, dark desires of the people who moved in the heights above him. The weather in Istanbul during the spring was a fickle thing, a constant shifting between the warmth of the sun and the freezing breath of the northern winds. Aras wore his one heavy coat until the seams began to fray, a garment that felt like a second skin, a protective layer against the indifference of the world. He was a man who lived a life of total, quiet discipline, never late for a shift and never missing a payment on his shared room. He was a person who took up very little space. A human ghost who believed that his survival depended on his ability to remain unnoticed by the eyes of power. Pain is a temporary biological state, but the cold weight of a gemstone is eternal. Aras was walking home through the winding streets of Galata one evening when a dark sedan with tinted windows and silver diplomatic plates pulled slowly over beside the curb. The window rolled down with a soft, electronic hum, revealing a man dressed in a suit of such fine wool that it seemed to absorb the streetlights. The man spoke in a voice that was calm, educated, and held the unmistakable weight of true authority. He told Aras that he was a patron of the arts, looking for a young man with a certain physical grace to model for a series of sculptures. The offer was more money than Aras would earn in a year at the fish market, a sum that would bring his sister across the border in a matter of weeks. He looked at the man's hands, which were clean, manicured, and perfectly steady on the steering wheel, and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of hope. Aras saw the man as a gatekeeper to the life he had always wanted, a person who recognized the potential that the rest of the city ignored. He climbed into the car, the scent of expensive leather and cedar wood filling his lungs as the door closed with a heavy, muffled thunk that silenced the noise of the street. Back at the Maiden's Tower, Kerem, the maritime officer, watched as his crew lowered a winch to recover the dark shape from the water. As the body was pulled onto the deck, the first thing that caught the light was not the pale skin of the victim, but a brilliant, shocking flash of deep blue. The body was that of a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in the simple clothes of a laborer. He had been strangled, his neck showing the faint, purple mark of a thin cord, but the rest of his body was untouched by violence or decomposition. It was as if he had been preserved in the cold salt of the Bosphorus for a very specific purpose. When the medical examiner turned the body over, the officers on the deck fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The victim's right hand had been surgically removed at the wrist, and in its place was a heavy, anatomically correct hand carved from solid lapis lazuli. The blue of the stone was so deep it appeared almost black in the shadows, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish that reflected the gray sky above. It was attached to the bone using multiple loops of high-purity silver wire, woven into a pattern that was both functional and disturbingly beautiful. The stone hand was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a perfect replica of the human limb it had replaced. The investigation was led by a detective who specialized in the ritualistic crimes of the city's elite, a man who understood that some people in Istanbul viewed murder as an aesthetic pursuit. He took the gemstone hand to the master jewelers of the Grand Bazaar, men who had spent their lives carving the rarest stones in the world. They looked at the lapis lazuli with a mixture of professional awe and deep, religious dread. They identified the stone as a rare, high-grade variety found only in a single mine in the mountains of Afghanistan, a material that was traditionally reserved for the ornaments of kings and the tools of the most powerful sorcerers. The jewelers explained that carving such a stone into the shape of a human hand would require hundreds of hours of labor and the use of specialized diamond-tipped tools. The anatomical detail was so precise that even the microscopic ridges of the fingerprints had been etched into the surface of the gemstone. It was not just a replacement, it was an upgrade, a transformation of the biological into the eternal. The detective realized that the killer was not a butcher, but a patron who viewed his victims as a canvas for his own dark, high-cost psychopathy. He was someone with the wealth to buy the finest materials and the skill to use them with surgical precision. Forensic analysis of the silver wire revealed a purity of 99.9%, a grade used only in high-end surgical implants or aerospace applications. It was a material that did not tarnish or react with human tissue, designed to remain embedded in the bone for decades without causing infection or decay. The way the wire had been sutured into the radius and ulna suggested a deep knowledge of orthopedic surgery and a total disregard for the pain of the living subject. The killer had worked slowly, ensuring that the attachment was permanent and that the stone hand would remain part of the body long after the heart stopped beating. Over the next 6 months, 3 more bodies were recovered from the Bosphorus, each one bearing the same chilling signature. All were young men. All were refugees or street workers who had vanished without a trace, and all had been upgraded with a lapis lazuli hand. The detective noticed that with each body, the craftsmanship of the gemstone hands became more complex and more beautiful. The first had been a simple, blocky carving, but the fourth was a translucent, glowing blue that seemed to hold its own light within the stone. The killer was practicing, refining his technique on the invisible members of society whose disappearances went unnoticed. You are floating in the dark, cold current of the strait, the weight of the silver wire pulling at your bone as the water moves through your lungs. Your right hand is no longer made of flesh and blood, but of a cold, blue stone that will never feel the heat of the sun or the touch of a sister's hand. You have been turned into a statue, a piece of art intended for a gallery that only the fish and the tides will ever visit. The man who did this to you is sitting in a high-rise apartment overlooking the water, sipping wine and thinking about the next stone he will carve. The investigation hit a wall when the detective tried to trace the diplomatic vehicle that Arras had been seen entering on the night of his disappearance. The license plates belonged to a small, obscure consulate that had been closed for years, and the car itself was a ghost in the traffic records of the city. The killer moved with the confidence of someone who lived above the law, a person who understood that in a city like Istanbul, power was the ultimate cloak of invisibility. He was a phantom who operated in the elite circles of the jewelry trade and the diplomatic corps, a predator who used his wealth to buy the silence of the world. A sting operation was launched in the jewelry district, with undercover officers posing as wealthy collectors looking for high-grade lapis lazuli carvings. They spent weeks in the back rooms of the Grand Bazaar, drinking tea and talking about the aesthetics of the blue stone. But the artist of the Bosphorus never appeared. The local craftsmen were terrified, whispering about a man who arrived in a silver car and spoke with the voice of a ghost. They claimed that the man had purchased the entire supply of Afghan lapis in the city, paying in gold coins that were hundreds of years old and bore the marks of the Ottoman sultans. I have looked into the eyes of the blue hands and felt the absolute, frozen intention of the mind that created them. The victims were never identified, their names lost in the files of the Missing Persons Bureau and the chaos of the regional conflicts. They were buried in a common grave on the outskirts of the city, their gemstone hands removed by the police and placed in the evidence locker. The killer had succeeded in his mission. He had taken the ordinary and made it extraordinary. But in doing so, he had erased the humanity of the men he claimed to be honoring. To him, they were nothing more than the stands for his masterpieces. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun in late 1995, and no more blue hand victims ever appeared in the waters of the Bosphorus. It was as if the artist had completed his series and moved on to a new medium, leaving behind only the cold, stone remnants of his obsession. The detective eventually retired, his career defined by the case he could never solve and the blue hands that haunted his dreams every time he looked at the sea. He would often sit by the Maiden's Tower, watching the tankers move into the mist and wondering if the silver car was still out there, prowling the shadows of the Galata. The lapis lazuli hands were eventually moved from the evidence locker to the Istanbul Police Forensic Museum, where they are still held today. They are displayed in a glass case, the blue of the stones still as vibrant and deep as the day they were recovered from the water. Students of forensics and art history come to look at them, marveling at the skill involved while trying to ignore the dark, ritualistic cost of the creation. The hands are the only physical evidence of a predator who lived as a ghost among the elite, a man who treated human life as a commodity to be traded for a moment of cold, aesthetic perfection. 2026 finds the Blue Hand case as one of Turkey's most famous unsolved serial crimes, a Gothic mystery that has passed into the realm of city legend. The Bosphorus still flows as it always has, a deep blue artery cutting through the heart of the city, carrying the secrets of the past out to the Black Sea. The refugees still arrive, their hands full of hope and their notebooks full of poems. moving through the shadows of a city that continues to look the other way. The artist of the Bosphorus remains a name without a face, a shadow that may still be walking the narrow paths of the Grand Bazaar, looking for the next piece of stone. The Blue Hands of Istanbul are a story of how the pursuit of beauty can become a path to the most profound and calculated forms of cruelty. It is a reminder that the people who are invisible to society are often the ones who are most vulnerable to the dark desires of the powerful. As the blue of the gemstone fades into the gray mist of the Bosphorus, we move toward the warm, quiet air of a nursery in the east. It is a place where the darkness does not use stone or wire, but a sweet-smelling smoke that carries the innocent away into a dream from which they will never wake. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in August 1995, a teacher named Meili was moving through the darkened dormitory of the Red Sun Nursery in Bay High. She adjusted a small, wooden fan on her desk, the blades whirring softly as they cut through the heavy, tropical air that smelled of salt and rain. In front of her, 20 small children lay on their cots, their breathing deep and rhythmic in the quiet of the mandatory nap hour. The room was a sea of small, rising and falling chests, a picture of absolute, state-guaranteed safety. Meili took great pride in her role at Red Sun, which was one of the most prestigious, state-run childcare centers in the coastal city. The nursery was a fortress, surrounded by high concrete walls, topped with jagged glass, and monitored by a security guard who sat at the only iron gate. Parents in Bay High fought for years to get their children into this system, believing it was the one place where the outside world could never reach them. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, but the security was as cold and rigid as a military barracks. One of the children under her care was a 4-year-old boy named June, a quiet child with a round face and a habit of clutching a small, faded blue cloth while he slept. June was the only son of 2 factory workers who had saved every yuan to ensure he had the best start in life. He was a boy who loved to draw suns with long, yellow rays, and would often share his midday fruit with the children who had less than him. He had a way of looking at the world with wide, unblinking eyes that made the adults around him feel a sense of profound responsibility. Jun's parents, Li and Fang, lived in a small apartment that smelled of jasmine tea and the industrial starch from their factory uniforms. Their entire world rotated around the boys' schedule. From the early morning walk to the nursery gates, to the evening stories they read by the light of a single bulb, they saw June as their hope for a future that went beyond the assembly line, a child who would one day study in the big cities and bring honor to their ancestors. Every evening, Li would lift the boy onto his shoulders, letting him pretend he could touch the stars over the South China Sea. June was known for his gentle laugh and the way he would hold his father's thumb with his entire hand as they walked through the crowded weekend markets. He was a child of absolute, unwavering trust, a boy who believed that as long as his parents and teachers were near, nothing bad could ever happen to him. This innocence was his most beautiful trait, a purity that made the teachers at Red Sun feel a fierce, protective need to keep the world's shadows at bay. He was a small, bright light in a city that was often gray and focused only on production. He had a favorite wooden duck that he pulled along the floor of the nursery, the wheels making a rhythmic click-clack that announced his arrival in every room. June was not a demanding child, but he had a way of leaning his head against a teacher's knee when he was tired that made them soften their voices. He was a collector of small things, filling his pockets with smooth stones from the courtyard and colorful wrappers from the sweets his mother gave him. These treasures were kept in a small tin box under his cot, a tiny museum of a life that was just beginning to expand. Every morning, Fang would comb Jun's dark hair into a neat part, kissing him on the forehead before he joined the line of children entering the school. He had a special red backpack that he carried with great seriousness, containing a small water bottle and a notebook for his drawings. June loved to listen to the stories of the ancient heroes who could fly through the air, and he would often try to jump from the lowest step of the stairs, believing that one day he would find the wind. He was a boy built of equal parts curiosity and kindness. A child who noticed when a ladybug was trapped on its back and would gently turn it over with a blade of grass. Jun's favorite food was the steamed dumplings his grandmother made on Sundays, and he would often save the last one to give to the neighborhood cat that lived near the trash bins. He had a small collection of picture books that he had memorized, turning the pages and reciting the words with a focused intensity that made his parents laugh with pride. He was a child who found joy in the smallest things, like the way the light caught the dust motes in the air or the sound of the rain on the tin roof. His life was a series of perfect, ordinary moments that were being woven into the fabric of a future that seemed limitless. On the morning of his disappearance, Jun had been particularly excited because his mother had promised to make him sweet bean buns for his evening snack. He had skipped through the iron gates of the nursery, waving a small, energetic hand at the security guard before disappearing into the yellow hallway. Meili remembered how he had looked back one last time, a bright smile on his face that seemed to light up the shadows of the entrance. It was a morning like any other, filled with the predictable sounds of children playing and the smell of industrial cleaner on the floors. The Red Sun Nursery followed a strict, military-like routine designed to instill discipline and order from a young age. Every activity was timed with the precision of a watch, from the morning exercises to the communal lunch and the mandatory 2-hour nap that began exactly at 1 o'clock. Meili watched the clock on the wall, knowing that the quiet of the dormitory was a necessary part of the children's development. She sat at her small desk, her head resting on her hand, feeling the weight of the afternoon heat pressing down on her shoulders. As Meili stood up to stretch her legs, she noticed a strange, thin vapor drifting through the metal slats of the ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was not the gray, acrid smoke of a fire, but a pale, almost invisible mist that carried a faint, cloying scent of sandalwood and dried herbs. She felt a sudden, heavy wave of lethargy wash over her, her eyelids growing leaden and her mind becoming thick like slow-moving honey. She tried to reach for the telephone on her desk, but her arm felt like it was made of cold, heavy stone. She sat back down, intending to investigate the smell, but her chin dropped to her chest and she fell into a sleep so deep it felt like being submerged in dark, bottomless water. The sounds of the nursery faded into a distant hum, and the light of the afternoon disappeared into a total, velvet blackness. She did not hear the soft click of a lock or the sound of light footsteps moving across the polished floor. The world simply ceased to exist for her, replaced by a dreamless void that lasted for over 60 minutes. When she finally jolted awake an hour later, the sun had shifted across the floor, and the other teacher was shaking her shoulder with a frantic, trembling hand. Meili looked toward the cots and saw that 19 children were stirring, their small bodies stretching in the afternoon light. But Jun's bed in the very center of the room was perfectly flat, the blue cloth he usually clutched sitting alone on the white pillow. The boy was gone, and the space he had occupied felt unnaturally cold, as if the air itself had been hollowed out. The teachers searched every corner of the dormitory, looking under the small wooden desks and inside the colorful toy chests, their voices rising in pitch and panic. They checked the bathrooms and the supply closets, calling Jun's name until their throats were raw and their eyes were stinging with tears. They ran to the main entrance, but the iron gate remained locked from the inside, and the security guard swore on his life that no one had entered. The compound was a closed box, yet a child had been lifted from its center like a ghost passing through a wall. Within the hour, the Beihai police had swarmed the nursery, cordoning off the building and questioning every staff member with a cold, relentless intensity. They examined the ventilation system and found a small, burnt-out clay pot hidden inside the main air intake duct on the roof. The pot contained the charred remains of a traditional herbal incense, a mixture known in the rural provinces as a powerful sedative used for calming restless livestock. It was a low-tech weapon used with surgical precision to turn a room of 20 people into a gallery of statues. When Li and Fang arrived at the gate that evening, they found a crowd of weeping parents and a line of stony-faced officers who refused to let them inside. The news that their son had been snatched from the very heart of the safest building in the city hit them like a physical blow to the chest. Fang collapsed onto the pavement, her hands clawing at the dirt, while Li stood in a silent, vibrating shock. Their world, which had been built on the foundation of Jun's future, had collapsed into a pile of dust in a single afternoon. The abduction of June was not an isolated incident, but the seventh such disappearance in Beihai in as many months. Each time, a child had been taken from a high-security nursery during the quietest hour of the day, with no signs of forced entry and no witnesses. The city was paralyzed by a terror that was as invisible as the incense smoke, a fear that turned every neighbor into a suspect. Parents began sleeping in front of the nursery gates, holding their remaining children with a grip that left marks on their skin. The police investigation eventually turned inward, focusing on the shadow network of logistics that allowed the kidnappers to move so efficiently through a monitored city. They began to monitor the taxi drivers who frequented the nursery districts and the low-level clerks who had access to the secret staff schedules. They realized that the kidnappers weren't just lucky, they were being fed precise information about the nursery's routine. Someone inside the system was selling the safety of the children for a handful of dirty bills, a betrayal that ran deeper than the crime itself. A breakthrough occurred when a local driver was caught trying to bypass a highway checkpoint with a child hidden in a secret compartment beneath the rear seat. Under interrogation, he revealed that the kidnappers used a relay system of ghost vehicles to move the children across provincial lines in under 24 hours. They were part of a sophisticated syndicate that treated the abduction of children with the cold, calculated logic of a high-speed courier service. The children were not viewed as human beings, but as high-value freight to be moved before the heat of the search arrived. The ringleaders had discovered that the Red Sun name carried a premium price on the black market in the northern provinces, where wealthy families were desperate for healthy heirs. They viewed the nurseries not as schools, but as warehouses of valuable inventory that could be harvested with a bit of incense and a well-timed bribe. The children were selected for their health and their lack of identifying marks, turned into commodities before they could even finish their afternoon dreams. It was a business model built on the absolute destruction of family bonds. The investigation revealed that the kidnappers had conducted dry runs for weeks, timing the guards and testing the ventilation system with harmless smoke. They were professionals who understood that the greatest weakness of any fortress is the predictable routine of the people who guard it. They used the nursery's own rules of discipline and timing to create the window of opportunity they needed to strike. By the time the bells rang to wake the children, June was already 50 kilometers away, his identity being systematically erased by a new set of clothes and a forged name. You are a parent standing in an empty bedroom where the smell of sandalwood still clings to the curtains like a persistent, mocking ghost. You look at the drawings on the wall and the small blue cloth left on the cot, and you realize that your entire world was traded away for a handful of cash. The safety you paid for was an illusion, a paper wall that was dissolved by a single puff of smoke and a few whispered secrets. I have seen how the promise of a state can fail a family in the most intimate way possible, leaving behind only the silence of an empty cot. The masterminds behind the syndicate were not hardened criminals from the docks, but former mid-level administrators who understood the vulnerabilities of the bureaucratic system. They used their knowledge of travel permits and health certificates to create a paper trail that made the children appear to be their own relatives. They moved with a military-like coordination, using a chain of safe houses that stretched thousands of miles into the interior of the country. They were men who valued efficiency over life, treating the agony of the parents as a necessary cost of doing business. In 1996, a massive crackdown led to the arrest of 15 people, including several nursery staff members who had been paid to provide the schedules. The two primary ringleaders were found guilty of human trafficking and were executed by the state within months of their sentencing. It was a swift, brutal end intended to send a message to the rest of the country that the children of the state were not for sale. But for the parents of the missing, the sound of the firing squad brought no comfort and no answers to their questions. Despite the arrests and the executions, only 2 of the 7 missing children were ever recovered and returned to their families in Beihai. The others had been sold and moved through so many hands that the trail went stone cold in the vast, mountainous regions of the north. They were growing up in homes where they were called by different names. Their memories of the red sun and the smell of jasmine tea slowly fading into the fog of childhood. They were the lost generation of the coastal city, living lives that were stolen before they could truly begin. The impact on the community was a permanent scar that changed the way children were raised in the coastal provinces for decades to come. The Red Sun name, once a symbol of prestige and safety, became a word that people whispered with a sense of deep, lingering dread. The nurseries installed heavy steel bars on every window and replaced the simple ventilation grates with sophisticated filtration systems that could detect even a trace of incense. But the trust that had once existed between the parents and the system had been shattered beyond any hope of repair. 2026 finds 5 of those children, including Jun, still listed as missing in the national databases of the Baby Come Home organization. Their parents are now elderly, their hair white and their faces etched with the lines of 30 years of waiting. They continue to update their DNA profiles every year, hoping for a match that will bridge the massive gap of time and distance. Li and Fang still live in the same small apartment, the bedroom kept exactly as it was on that Tuesday in August, a shrine to a boy who vanished into a cloud of smoke. The wooden duck that Jun used to pull along the floor sits on a shelf in the living room, its wheels dusty and silent. Li often takes it down and holds it, remembering the click-clack sound it made and the laugh that always followed it. They do not talk much about the future anymore, as their world stopped moving forward on the day the nursery gates failed them. They are ghosts living in a city that has moved on, their lives defined by a tragedy that has become a footnote in the history of the province. The Red Sun nurseries are still in operation, but the security is now digital, with high-definition cameras and motion sensors replacing the simple iron gates. The teachers no longer sleep during the nap hour, and the smell of incense is strictly forbidden within the city limits. But the fear remains in the quiet corners of Beihai, a collective memory of the time when the air itself turned against the innocent. It is a story of how a system of total control can be dismantled by a single, well-placed secret and a total lack of human empathy. The heavy, cloying scent of the nursery smoke is a reminder that the things we use to bring peace can also be used to steal our future. It is a story of how the very air we breathe can be turned into a cage if someone has the patience and the coldness to design it. As the sun sets over the coastal nurseries of Beihai, we move toward a different kind of pattern, one drawn in white dust on a construction site. It is a place where a man is using the math of the universe to mark the end of a life, his hands steady as he draws a circle that no one will ever be able to escape. In the late summer of 1996, the city of Pune was a skeletal landscape of rising concrete and red dust. Aryun, a 65-year-old night watchman, adjusted the wick of his kerosene lantern as the last of the construction crews filtered out of the half-finished high-rise. He stood on the 4th floor, his shadow stretching long and thin across the raw, gray pillars that reached toward the darkening sky. The air was thick with the scent of wet cement and the dry, metallic tang of rebar. Precision is often the mask that a fractured mind wears to look like a genius. Arjun liked precision himself. Having spent 40 years as a clerk for the Indian Railways before he retired, he was a man of small, unbreakable habits, the kind of person who could tell the time of day simply by the angle of the sun hitting the station clock. He had taken this night shift not because he was bored, but because his youngest granddaughter, Meena, had dreams of becoming a doctor. Every rupee he earned from guarding the skeletons of these new buildings went into a small, dented steel box hidden beneath his bed. Arjun did not mind the long, silent hours or the persistent ache in his knees from climbing the unfinished stairs. He felt a sense of quiet pride in being the silent protector of the city's future. To him, these buildings were not just investments for wealthy businessmen. They were the physical proof that the world was moving forward into a brighter era. His nightly routine was a masterclass in slow, methodical discipline. He would arrive at the site exactly 30 minutes before his shift began, carrying a tiffin carrier filled with soft chapatis and a thermos of strong, sweet ginger tea. He would sit with the daytime foreman, a man 20 years, his junior, and listen to the gossip of the construction trade. Arjun was respected by the workers because he never cut corners and he never fell asleep on duty, even in the dead of the monsoon. During his rounds, he would hum old Marathi folk songs to keep the silence of the site at bay. He had a small, silver-cased transistor radio that he kept tucked into his belt, usually tuned to a station that played classical ragas. The music was a thin, melodic thread that connected him to the world outside the concrete walls. Arjun knew every creak of the floorboards and every whistle of the wind through the open window frames of the unfinished apartments. He was a man who found beauty in the order of things, from the way the bricks were stacked to the alignment of the plumbing pipes. At home, his small room was a testament to his character, with his clothes folded in neat squares and his few books arranged by height. He was a widower who still talked to the photograph of his wife every morning, telling her about Mina's progress in school. His life was a narrow, well-tended garden of responsibility and quiet affection. Arjun often spent his breaks looking out over the city lights, imagining the families that would eventually fill these rooms with laughter and noise. He felt like a ghost inhabiting a future that had not yet arrived, a temporary resident of a space that would soon belong to someone else. He took care to sweep the dust from the areas where he sat, maintaining a small patch of cleanliness in the middle of the chaotic construction site. He was a man who believed that dignity was found in the way one treated their surroundings. His coworkers often joked that Arjun was more of a librarian than a watchman because of the way he recorded every delivery in his ledger. He used a fountain pen that he filled with blue-black ink every Sunday, writing in a script that was as elegant and precise as a printed book. He recorded the weather, the number of cement bags delivered, and even the names of the stray dogs that frequented the site. 2. Arjun. A life unrecorded was a life half-lived. He had a special relationship with a small, stray mongrel he called Raja, who would follow him on his rounds for the price of a crust of bread. Raja was his only companion in the long hours between midnight and dawn, a silent witness to the steady progress of the building. Arjun felt a deep sense of peace during those nights, the city's roar reduced to a distant, oceanic hum. He was a man at rest with his place in the world, a steady heartbeat in the center of a changing city. As he climbed the stairs that night, he felt a flicker of thought about the engineering of the building. Pramio, wondering if the architect knew how much the wind vibrated through the steel core. It was a fleeting, sharp observation, the kind that only a man who spends his life in the bones of structures would ever have. He adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the silver radio against his hip, and stepped out onto the vast, open floor of the 10th story. The first off-key detail appeared near the pile of timber used for the concrete molds. Arjun noticed a small white cylinder sitting on top of a stack of plywood, looking far too clean and purposeful for a construction site. He picked it up and realized it was a piece of surveyor's chalk, the expensive, high-density kind used for marking precise architectural lines. It was brand new, its tip perfectly sharp, and it had been placed there with a deliberate, almost mocking intention. Arjun frowned, looking around the darkened floor, but the only movement was the swaying of a nearby crane in the night breeze. He tucked the chalk into his pocket, intending to ask the foreman about it in the morning, and continued his round toward the service elevator. The silence of the site felt different tonight, heavier and more focused, as if the concrete were absorbing the sound of his footsteps. Raja, usually at his heels, had stopped at the top of the stairs, his hackles raised in a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. The discovery happened at 6 o'clock the following morning when the site foreman, a man named Gupta, arrived to unlock the main supply shed. He looked up toward the center of the unfinished ground floor lobby and saw a shape that did not belong in the morning light. Arjun was lying flat on his back in the center of the vast concrete expanse, his lantern sitting extinguished beside him. Gupta ran toward the old man, calling his name, but his voice died in his throat as he reached the edge of the scene. Arjun had been killed by a single, massive blow to the back of the head, likely delivered with one of the heavy concrete blocks stacked nearby. But the violence of the act was secondary to the chilling, impossible display that surrounded his body. Using thick, white surveyor's chalk, someone had drawn a massive, intricate mandala that radiated outward from Arjun for 5 meters in every direction. The circles were perfect, the lines were unwavering, and the geometry involved complex, interlocking triangles that seemed to vibrate against the gray floor. The local Pune police were on the scene within the hour, led by a detective who had spent his career in the city's emerging middle class. He stood at the edge of the chalk lines, refusing to step inside the pattern, feeling a deep, instinctive sense of wrongness. The mandala was not a random scribble. It was a professional drafting project executed with the precision of a master architect. There were no smudges, no stray marks, and no signs of the panic or haste that usually accompany a murder. Forensic experts were called in to document the scene, and they found that the circles were mathematically perfect, down to the millimeter. They determined that the killer had used a specialized set of large-scale drafting compasses and straightedges to complete the work. The complexity of the design suggested that the killer had spent at least 3 or 4 hours kneeling in the dust beside Arjun's body, working in total silence. It was an act of obsessive, ritualistic devotion that treated the murder as a mere starting point for a larger project. The investigation revealed that this was the 3rd such murder in Pune in the last 4 months. At each site, an elderly night watchman had been killed with a blunt object, and a massive, geometric chalk circle had been drawn around them. The previous victims had also been men of impeccable character, retired professionals who were well liked by their communities. Nothing was ever stolen from the sites, and no equipment had been sabotaged. The killer's only focus was the geometry of the space around the dead. Police began to interview the architectural firms and engineering contractors associated with the 3 buildings, looking for a disgruntled employee or a student with a history of mental instability. They found that all 3 buildings had been designed by the same elite firm, but the lead architect had a solid alibi for all 3 nights. The detective began to suspect that the killer was someone who knew the buildings intimately, someone who viewed the half-finished structures as a sacred geometry that required a human sacrifice to be complete. The chalk phantom became a shadow that haunted the dreams of every night watchman in the city. The construction boom continued, but the atmosphere at the sites changed from one of progress to one of watchful, paranoid silence. Extra guards were hired, and high-powered floodlights were installed, turning the skeletons of the buildings into islands of artificial day. Yet, the killer seemed to move through the light as easily as he did the dark, leaving no fingerprints and no physical evidence of his presence. You are standing in the center of a half-finished high-rise, and the only sound is the rhythmic scrape-clack of chalk against the concrete. The wind is whistling through the empty window frames, but the hand holding the chalk is as steady as a surgeon's. You can see the intricate triangles and the perfect arcs beginning to form around the body on the floor, a white web that seems to pull the very soul out of the stone. It is a moment of absolute, frozen focus where the life of a human being is less important than the radius of a circle. Analysis of the chalk lines showed that they were drawn with a consistent, heavy pressure that never wavered, even in the most complex parts of the mandala. This suggested a person of immense physical strength and a high degree of motor control, likely someone in their prime. The drafting experts noted that the geometry used in the mandalas was a specific, ancient form used in the consecration of temples. The killer wasn't just drawing, He was performing a ritual intended to fix the building in time and space, using the life force of the watchman as a pivot point. The detective followed a lead to a former site engineer who had been fired from the firm a year earlier after a series of obsessive, unhinged reports about incorrect vibrations in the city's foundations. The man, a brilliant but troubled graduate, had disappeared into the slums of the city shortly after losing his license. When the police raided his small, rented room, they found the walls covered from floor to ceiling in chalk drawings. There were thousands of interlocking circles and triangles, all focused on the coordinates of the construction sites across Pune. However, the engineer was found to have died of a fever 3 weeks before Arjun's murder. His body discovered by a neighbor in a state of advanced decomposition. This discovery sent the investigation back to the beginning, leaving the police with the terrifying realization that the killer was still out there, and he was likely someone they had already interviewed. The chalk phantom was not a lone madman, but perhaps someone hidden in plain sight, a professional who viewed the city as a canvas for his own dark, mathematical religion. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun in late 1996. Shortly after the local media began to report on the ritualistic nature of the crimes, no one was ever arrested, and the chalk phantom was never identified, leaving a permanent gap in the city's criminal history. The 3 buildings where the murders occurred were completed on schedule, and today they stand as luxury apartments and corporate offices, their dark history buried under layers of marble and glass. The construction boom eventually paved over the red dust and the memories of the men who guarded the skeletons. I have stood on those finished floors and wondered if the people living there can feel the geometry of the shadow beneath their feet. The mystery of the chalk circle phantoms remains a core cold case of the Pune registry, a story told in hushed tones by the aging officers who were there on those cold, dusty mornings. They talk about the precision of the lines and the absolute silence of the sites, a perfection that felt more like a haunting than a crime. The identity of the man with the surveyor's chalk remains a ghost in the city's architectural blueprints. 2026 finds the outskirts of Pune as a sprawling metropolis where the construction sites of the 90s are now the heart of the business district. The families living in the high-rises, where Arjun once walked his rounds, have no idea that their homes were once the center of a ritualistic map of death. Meena, the granddaughter, did eventually become a doctor, her education paid for by the money her grandfather had guarded so carefully in his steel box. She still visits the site on the anniversary of his death, leaving a single, white flower on the sidewalk outside the towering glass building. The case remains officially unsolved, categorized as a cold file that will likely never see a courtroom. The chalk phantom has passed into the realm of urban legend, a cautionary tale for those who believe that logic and math are always tools of progress. The city continues to grow, its foundations built on the hard work of thousands of men like Arjun, but also on the secrets that the concrete refuses to give up. The white chalk has long since been washed away by the monsoons, but the pattern it left on the soul of the city remains. The geometry of the construction site is a story of how the things we build to house our lives can also become the stage for our destruction. It is a reminder that even in a world of steel and glass, there are people who still follow the ancient, dark rhythms of the earth. As the dust of Pune settles into the night, we move toward the freezing forests of the north. It is a place where the shadows do not use chalk, but a cold, heavy axe, and the silence of the winter is the only witness to the annihilation of a family. In the deep winter of 1995, a heavy, suffocating silence lay over the Lviv Oblast in western Ukraine. A man stood at the edge of a dense pine forest, his boots sinking into a fresh layer of powdery snow that had fallen since twilight. He watched a small farmhouse 300 meters away, where a single yellow light flickered in a kitchen window. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, a signal of warmth and safety that he intended to extinguish before the sun rose. He adjusted the weight of a heavy, metal object tucked under his arm, and waited for the light to go out. The snow continued to fall in large wet flakes that clung to the bark of the trees and the wire fences of the livestock pens. It was a cold that felt personal, a weight that pressed against the chest and turned every breath into a plume of white steam. The man in the tree line moved his fingers inside his heavy woolen gloves, feeling the slow, rhythmic pulse of his own blood. He was not in a hurry, for he knew that in this part of the world, during this time of year, no one would be coming to help. The isolation of the village of Bratkovici was his most effective accomplice, a silence that he had learned to navigate like a phantom. Inside the farmhouse, Pyotr Novosad was tending to the iron stove, his calloused hands moving with a mechanical familiarity born of decades of rural labor. He was a man of 52 years, with a face etched by the harsh winds of the Ukrainian steppe and eyes that rarely found rest. He took pride in the way his woodpile was stacked, a perfect wall of birch and pine that represented the survival of his family through the coming months. Pyotr was a husband and a father of 4, a man who viewed his responsibilities as a sacred weight that he carried without complaint. He believed that as long as the fire was burning, his world was secure. His wife, Maria, was at the wooden table, her head bowed as she mended a pair of woolen socks by the light of a single kerosene lamp. She was a woman who spoke in low, melodic tones, her voice a comforting anchor for the children who slept in the room next door. Maria knew the sound of every floorboard in the house and the specific whistle of the wind as it caught the corner of the roof. She found a deep sense of contentment in the domestic rituals of the evening. The rhythmic click of her needles, a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Their life was a collection of small, hard-won victories over the elements and the economy. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were huddled under heavy goose-down quilts in the adjacent room. They were a tight-knit group, their dreams filled with the upcoming village festivals and the promise of the spring thaw. The eldest son, Stepan, often stayed awake late into the night, listening to his father's steady footsteps and the low murmur of his parents' conversation. He wanted to be a farmer like his father, a man of the earth who understood the secrets of the soil and the needs of the animals. To Stepan, the farmhouse was an impenetrable castle, a place where the darkness of the forest was kept at bay by the strength of his family. Pyotr checked the heavy iron bolt on the front door, a ritual he performed every night before the lights went out. He felt the cold metal against his palm and noted the way the wood of the door had swollen slightly from the moisture in the air. It was a solid, dependable barrier, one that had stood for generations and had kept out the wolves and the wandering strangers of the past. He looked at Maria and gave her a small, tired smile, a gesture that conveyed a lifetime of shared struggle and unspoken affection. They were a team, a partnership built on the shared labor of the fields and the quiet endurance of the winters. The family's daily rhythm was dictated by the needs of their livestock and the shifting light of the sun. They rose before the birds, breaking the ice on the water troughs and pitching hay into the mangers, while the stars were still visible in the frozen sky. It was a life of raw necessity, where the absence of a single cow could mean the difference between a year of comfort and a year of hunger. Pyotr taught his sons how to track the deer in the woods and how to read the clouds to predict the coming storms. He believed that the forest was a resource to be respected, never suspecting that it was currently hiding a predator that followed no natural law. Maria maintained a small garden behind the house where she grew potatoes, cabbage, and the medicinal herbs that kept the family healthy through the damp autumns. She was a woman who saw the beauty in the curve of a pumpkin or the vibrant green of a fresh row of leeks. Her hands were never idle, even during the long winter nights when the fields were buried under 2 meters of snow. She believed that a busy home was a happy home, and she filled the rooms with the smell of baking bread and the sound of old folk songs. Her presence was the warmth that the iron stove could never quite replicate on its own. The Novosads were well respected in Bratkovici, known as a family that would always share their grain or their labor with a neighbor in need. They attended the small village church every Sunday, their voices joining the choir in a celebration of the community that had survived the collapse of the old systems. Pyotr was a man who valued his reputation above his wealth, believing that a person was only as good as the word they gave to their fellow man. He felt a deep sense of connection to the land of his ancestors, a feeling that he was merely a temporary steward of a legacy that would outlive him. I have stood in the silence of a frozen forest and felt the way the cold seems to sharpen the edge of everything, making the world feel both beautiful and dangerously fragile. This companion voice is a reminder that the quiet we seek for peace is often the same quiet a predator uses to hide their approach. The Novosads lived in a world where the primary threats were the weather and the crops, things that could be understood and prepared for. They had no context for the kind of calculated, inhuman malice that was currently measuring the distance from the tree line to their front porch. To them, the darkness was just the absence of light, not a place where a monster waited to strike. As the clock on the mantel struck 11, Pyotr leaned over and blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the kitchen into a thick, velvet darkness. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim glow of the embers in the stove, feeling the weight of the day's work settling into his bones. The house felt settled and secure, the breathing of his children, a soft, rhythmic background to the groan of the settling timber. He walked toward the bedroom, his hand trailing along the familiar edge of the wooden table, thinking about the repairs he would need to make to the tractor once the snow cleared. He lay down beside Maria, pulling the heavy quilts up to his chin and listening to the wind rattling the shutters. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times, a lonely, persistent howling that served only to make the warmth of the bed feel more profound. Pyotr felt a sense of deep, weary contentment, the kind that only comes to a man who has fulfilled his duties to the best of his ability. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting toward the image of the green shoots of wheat emerging from the dark earth in the spring. He did not hear the soft crunch of a boot on the frozen porch outside. The unusual event happened with a sudden, jarring finality that left no room for confusion. You are lying in the absolute dark, and the silence is so profound that you can hear the internal hum of your own ears. Suddenly, the faint, electronic buzzing of the refrigerator in the kitchen stops, and the small, red light on the radio across the room vanishes. The power has not flickered or dimmed. The line has been severed with a clean, metallic snip that suggests a deliberate intention. The house is no longer a fortress. It is a dark box at the edge of a forest, and the rules of the world have just changed in a single, silent heartbeat. Pyotr sat up in bed, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs that he could feel in his throat. He reached for the flashlight on his nightstand, but his fingers fumbled in the dark, the familiar geography of his room suddenly feeling foreign and hostile. He heard a sharp, cracking sound from the kitchen, the unmistakable noise of a window pane being forced from its frame. It was a sound that did not belong in the middle of a winter night, a violation of the sanctity of his home that turned his blood into ice. He did not call out, his instincts telling him that the silence was now his only hope of defense. The discovery of the tragedy occurred the following morning when a neighbor, a man named Victor, noticed that no smoke was rising from the Novosad chimney. In a village where the fire was the only thing keeping the occupants alive, a cold chimney was a signal of a profound and immediate crisis. Victor walked across the field, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic sound in the deep snow, and noticed that the power lines leading to the house were dangling uselessly from the pole. The front door was standing wide open, and a dusting of snow had already begun to accumulate on the polished wooden floor of the entryway. Victor stepped inside, his voice catching in his throat as he called out Pyotr's name, receiving only the echo of the wind in return. He walked into the kitchen and saw the shattered glass on the floor and the cold embers in the stove, the air in the house already as freezing as the forest outside. As he moved toward the bedrooms, he saw a dark, frozen stain on the wall that made him stop and turn away, his stomach knotting with a sudden, visceral nausea. He ran from the house and toward the center of the village, his screams for help breaking the heavy silence of the Bratkovici morning. The local police arrived hours later, their vehicles struggling through the snowdrifts that had grown overnight. They were followed by a unit of the regional militia, men who were used to the rough justice of the rural provinces, but were unprepared for the scene they found inside. The investigators noted that the killer had moved with a military efficiency, moving from room to room with a speed that suggested he had mapped the layout of the house before entering. There were no signs of a struggle in the beds, no evidence that the victims had ever had a chance to realize they were in danger. The investigation revealed that the Novosads were not the first family to be annihilated in this manner during the winter of 1995. Over the course of several months, 52 people had been murdered in isolated villages across the Lviv Oblast. Their homes often burned to the ground to destroy evidence. The killer left no fingerprints, no consistent footprints, and no witnesses who could describe his face or his movements. He was a ghost who moved through the freezing forests with an impossible speed, striking in different regions before the police could even secure the previous crime scene. The Winter Terminator, as the media began to call him, became a source of absolute, paralyzing terror for the rural population of western Ukraine. Families began to abandon their homes at night, huddling together in village halls or church basements, where the doors could be guarded by armed men. The military was eventually deployed to guard the forest edges, and the sounds of the winter night were no longer ignored but scrutinized with a desperate, paranoid intensity. The predator had successfully turned the landscape into a cage, and the villagers were the prey waiting for the next snowfall. Forensic reconstruction of the crimes suggested a killer who operated with a chilling lack of emotion, treating the murders as a mundane job that required only precision and timing. He used a sawed-off shotgun to execute the men of the house, ensuring that the primary threat was neutralized instantly. For the women and children, he used a hunting knife or a heavy axe, conserving ammunition and moving with a silent, practiced lethality. He was a man who understood the architecture of the human body and the psychological impact of a sudden, total darkness on his victims. The twist in the case came in April of 1996, when a man named Anatoly Onoprienko was staying with a relative in the city of Yavoriv. The relative, a man who had grown suspicious of Anatoly's frequent, unexplained disappearances at night, began to search through the belongings Anatoly kept in a small, locked suitcase. Hidden beneath a layer of dirty clothes, the relative found a collection of jewelry, silver spoons, and several high-quality watches that did not belong to a man of Anatoly's modest means. More importantly, he found a sawed-off shotgun and a heavy, blood-stained hunting knife tucked into a secret compartment. The relative contacted the authorities, and a massive police tactical unit descended on the apartment in the early hours of the morning. Onoprienko was caught while he was sleeping, his hands reaching for the suitcase, even as the officers pinned him to the floor. He did not resist, and he did not claim to be innocent. He simply watched the police with a calm, unblinking stare that chilled even the most hardened investigators. When they searched his pockets, they found a small, handwritten list of village names and a series of dates that matched the massacres of the previous winter. The climax of the case occurred during the interrogation, where Onoprienko began to describe his crimes with a clinical, detached arrogance. He treated the deaths of the Novosads and the 50 other victims as a project he had been commissioned to complete by inner voices that he claimed were extraterrestrial. He showed no remorse, often laughing as the detectives showed him the photographs of the crime scenes he had created. He spoke about the feeling of the heavy axe in his hand and the way the snow looked when it was stained red, treating the horror as a series of aesthetic observations. He explained that he had chosen the isolated farmhouses because they were the easiest targets, places where the rules of civilization could be suspended for a few hours. Onoprienko believed that he was drawing a cross of blood across the map of Ukraine, a ritual that he believed would grant him a permanent place in history. He was a man who had been rejected by society and had decided to take his revenge on the most basic unit of human connection, the family. To him, The 52 lives he had taken were merely the ink he used to write his name in the soil of his country. The explanation of the truth revealed a man who had spent years as a drifter, moving through the shadows of the post-Soviet world with a total lack of empathy or moral compass. He had been a sailor, a worker, and a small-time criminal, but his true calling was the annihilation of others. The investigators realized that he had succeeded for so long because he had no pattern other than his preference for the winter and the isolation of the rural villages. He was a predator who understood that in the chaos of a newly independent nation, a man who moved with a military discipline could be invisible. Anatoly Onoprienko was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. As Ukraine had recently abolished the death penalty as a condition for joining the Council of Europe, the verdict was met with a wave of public outrage, with many calling for a public execution to match the brutality of his crimes. He was placed in a specialized, high-security unit where he remained in a state of total, defiant silence for the rest of his life. He remained the beast of Ukraine, a shadow that lived in the heart of the national memory, a reminder of the darkness that can emerge when the world is in flux. I have thought about the cross of blood and the mind that believed a map could be made of human lives. This reflection is a cold weight, a realization that some people do not seek power or wealth, but the absolute, final control over the breath of another. Onoprienko was a man who found a purpose in the void, a mission in the silence of a snowy field. He did not see the families as people, but as obstacles to be removed in the service of a dark, internal geometry. The Terminator was a product of a world that had lost its center, a predator born in the gaps between the old laws and the new. 2026 finds the village of Bratkovici as a quiet, rural community that still keeps the memories of the 1995 massacres alive in the stories they tell their children. The farmhouse where the Novosads lived was never rebuilt, the charred foundation eventually reclaimed by the weeds and the pine needles of the forest. People still avoid the tree line at twilight, and the sight of a flickering light in a distant window carries a weight of history that the younger generation cannot fully understand. The winter Terminator is a ghost that haunts the winter wind, a cautionary tale of the darkness that waits at the edge of the woods. Anatoly Onoprienko died of heart failure in a Ukrainian prison in 2013, taking the final secrets of his cross of blood to an unmarked grave. He never expressed regret, and he never asked for forgiveness, remaining a figure of cold, unblinking malice until his final breath. The families he destroyed, including the Novosads, have left behind a legacy of endurance, their names etched into the stones of the village church. They are the silent witnesses to a crime that redefined the meaning of terror in the rural heartland of the East. Their lives, a testament to the fragile beauty of a fire in the winter. The massacres of the Lviv Oblast are a story of how a single, disciplined predator can turn a landscape of peace into a gallery of absolute, frozen horror. It is a reminder that the warmth of our homes is only as secure as the silence of the forest that surrounds us. As the winter snow fades into the gray morning of Ukraine, we move toward the jagged peaks of Patagonia. It is a place where the darkness does not use an axe or a gun, but a surreal, chilling order. A cave is waiting in the ice, and inside, the belongings of the dead are being sorted by color, waiting for a passenger who will never return. In October of 1995, a twin-engine Cessna cut through the thin, frigid air above the southern Patagonian icefield. Below the wings, the jagged granite spires of the Fitzroy Massif rose like broken teeth from a sea of white. The pilot, a man named Julian, adjusted his headset and looked out over the horizon where the blue of the glaciers met the deep indigo of the afternoon sky. It was a perfect day for a sightseeing tour, the kind of clear, high-visibility weather that made the treacherous peaks of southern Argentina look almost welcoming. Julian was 42 years old and had spent over half of his life navigating the unpredictable thermal currents of the Andes. He was a man of quiet precision, known among the local aviation community for his obsession with safety and his encyclopedic knowledge of the local weather patterns. He treated his aircraft with a level of care that bordered on the religious, spending hours every morning inspecting the fuel lines and the control surfaces before his first flight. Julian did not fly for the thrill of the heights, but for the clarity that came with being suspended in a world of absolute, unmoving stone. On the ground in El Calafate, he was a creature of habit, living in a small cabin filled with meticulously organized flight logs and navigation charts. He spent his evenings studying the shifting movements of the glaciers, fascinated by the way the ice carved the landscape over thousands of years. Julian was a man who found comfort in the predictable laws of physics, believing that if one respected the mountains would return that respect. He was the most requested pilot for the high-altitude tours because he never took risks and he never missed a landmark. Joining him on this flight were 5 passengers who had come to Patagonia to witness the raw, end-of-the-world beauty of the region. Among them were Hans and Greta Weber, a couple from Germany who were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary with the trip of a lifetime. Hans was a retired civil engineer who appreciated the structural integrity of the mountain ranges, while Greta was a retired schoolteacher with a passion for rare alpine flowers. They had spent months planning their itinerary, checking off each destination with a sense of quiet, shared accomplishment. Hans was the kind of man who carried a physical map even when he had a digital guide, preferring the tactile feel of the paper and the certainty of the printed coordinates. He spent the first part of the flight identifying the various peaks and valleys, his finger tracing their progress on the map spread across his lap. Greta watched him with a soft, indulgent smile, her hand resting on his arm as the plane banked gently over the Perito Moreno Glacier. They were a team, 2 people who had built a life on a foundation of mutual trust and a shared curiosity about the world. In the seat behind them was Leo, a 24-year-old photography student who had saved for 3 years to afford the specialized lenses he needed for this trip. He sat with his camera pressed against the window, his finger hovering over the shutter as he waited for the light to hit the ice at the perfect angle. Leo was a young man of intense focus, seeing the world as a series of compositions and frames. He had a notebook filled with sketches of the light patterns he expected to find at high altitudes, treating his art with the same clinical discipline that Julian applied to his flying. The final 2 passengers were Marcus and Elena, a retired couple from Buenos Aires who had spent their lives working in the chaotic heart of the city. They were quiet, unassuming people who had sought the silence of the mountains as a refuge from the noise of their previous existence. Marcus was a man who enjoyed the simple rhythm of a long walk, while Elena found peace in the vast, open spaces where the sky seemed to touch the earth. They held hands throughout the ascent, their eyes wide with a sense of wonder that made them look much younger than their 60 years. The plane carried more than just people. It held their histories, their small collections of belongings, and their carefully packed suitcases. Inside the luggage compartment were the tools of their daily lives: Greta's favorite wool cardigan, Hans's collection of engineering journals, and Leo's spare rolls of film. These objects were the anchors that connected them to the world they had left behind, the physical proof of their identities and their plans. They were traveling light, but everything they had brought was essential, chosen with a sense of purpose and a clear intention of return. As the flight reached its midpoint near the Fitzroy Spire, Julian noticed a sudden, dark line of clouds boiling up from the Chilean side of the mountains. In Patagonia, the weather does not change. It arrives with the force of a physical collision. The clear blue sky was swallowed in a matter of seconds by a wall of gray, turbulent mist that turned the cabin into a rattling, vibrating cage of metal. Julian felt the control yoke buck in his hands as the first downdraft hit the Cessna, dropping the aircraft several hundred feet in a single, sickening heartbeats. The plane was now flying blind in a whiteout, the ground and the sky merging into a single, terrifying void of swirling snow and ice. Julian checked his instruments, but the compass was spinning erratically, caught in the electromagnetic interference of the massive mountain peaks. He reached for the radio to broadcast a distress signal, but the only sound in his headset was a steady, rhythmic hiss of static. He felt a cold, sharp flash of realization that the fuel was being consumed twice as fast as he struggled against the headwind. There was no way back to the airfield, and there was no place to land in the jagged graveyard below. The Cessna vanished from the radar screens at the Regional Air Traffic Control Center at exactly 4:14 in the afternoon. For the next 3 weeks, a massive aerial search was conducted across the glaciers, with planes and helicopters crisscrossing the Fitzroy region whenever the weather allowed. They looked for the flash of silver metal against the white, the smoke of a signal fire, or the dark scar of a crash site in the snow. But the mountains were vast, and the ice was constantly shifting, swallowing anything that fell into its deep, blue crevices. The search was eventually called off, and the 6 people on Flight 420 were declared lost. 14 months later, in December of 1996, a team of 3 professional ice climbers was navigating a remote ravine 50 miles north of the supposed flight path. They were seeking shelter from a sudden, blinding squall and spotted the dark mouth of an unmapped cave system carved into a granite cliff. The climbers scrambled inside, their headlamps cutting through a darkness that had not been disturbed for 1,000 years. As they moved deeper into the cavern to escape the wind, the lead climber stopped so abruptly that his partner nearly collided with him in the shadows. Arranged in the center of the cavern floor, 50 meters from the entrance, were the suitcases and bags of the missing passengers. They were not scattered or damaged as one would expect from a crash. They were sitting in a neat, orderly row, looking as though they had been placed there by a porter in a luxury hotel. There was no sign of the aircraft, no pieces of twisted metal, and no smell of fuel. The cave was a tomb of absolute, frozen silence, where the only movement was the dust motes dancing in the beams of the climbers' lights. As the climbers moved closer, they realized the situation was far more surreal than a simple discovery of lost luggage. Every single suitcase had been meticulously unpacked. The contents were not strewn across the floor, but were arranged in a series of perfect, geometric stacks. Hans's engineering journals were piled by size, their spines aligned with the precision of a library shelf. Leo's spare rolls of film were lined up in a straight line, each one equidistant from the next. The order was so absolute that it felt aggressive, a mockery of the chaos that should have followed a mountain aviation disaster. The most chilling detail was the way the clothing had been organized. Shirts, trousers, and jackets had been folded into tight, professional squares and sorted by color. A stack of red garments sat in one corner, blue in another, and white in the center. It looked as though someone had spent days, perhaps weeks, obsessively categorizing the remains of 5 separate lives. To see a bright red sweater sitting perfectly folded on a bed of ancient gray dust is to understand that someone has tried to impose a human logic on a place where humans do not belong. On a flat stone ledge that acted as a natural shelf, the passengers' toiletries had been lined up in a parallel row. Greta's silver hairbrush was sitting exactly 1 inch away from Hans's shaving kit. A bright red toothbrush and a silver comb were placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the rock, their handles pointing toward the back of the cave. There were no signs of use, no spilled powder, no discarded wrappers, and no smears of paste. It was a display intended for an audience that was no longer there, a ritual of hygiene performed in the heart of a glacier. The climbers searched the rest of the cave system, their hearts hammering against their ribs with a growing sense of dread. They expected to find the bodies of the passengers huddled together for warmth, or at least the skeletal remains of a survival camp. But the cave was empty of life and death. There were no sleeping bags, no remains of a fire, and no discarded food containers. There were no footprints in the soft silt of the cave floor other than the fresh tracks of the climbers themselves. 6 people and their plane had vanished. Yet their belongings had been transported 50 miles and organized with the care of a museum exhibit. The Argentine Air Force launched a new investigation. sending a forensic team to the cave to document the find. They confirmed that the luggage belonged to the victims of Flight 420, but they could find no rational explanation for how it got there. To transport that amount of heavy luggage across the crevasses and ice fields between the crash zone and the cave would require a team of experts and days of grueling labor. No helicopters had been reported in the area, and no tracks of a large group were ever found in the snow surrounding the ravine. You are standing in a cave where the air is so cold it feels like it is trying to freeze the very thoughts in your head. You look at a stack of neatly folded blue shirts and realize that the person who wore them is nowhere to be found. The order of the room is not a sign of survival, but a sign of a profound, obsessive madness. Someone sat in this darkness, surrounded by the belongings of the dead, and decided that the only way to endure the silence was to sort it by color and size. You are standing in a space where the human mind has finally snapped under the weight of the mountains. The investigators considered the theory of paradoxical nesting, a psychological state sometimes seen in victims of extreme hypothermia. In this state, a person may engage in repetitive, organizational tasks as their brain begins to shut down, trying to create a sense of safety in their final moments. But this did not explain how the luggage was moved 50 miles across impossible terrain, or why there was no wreckage nearby. It also did not explain why there were no biological traces, no hair, no skin cells, and no fingerprints found on the folded clothes or the stacked journals. A second theory emerged involving a third party, a lone hermit or a scavenger who might have found the wreckage, looted it, and moved the contents to the cave. But this person would have had to bypass one of the most intensive aerial searches in Argentine history without ever being seen, and it still left the question of the staging. A scavenger takes what is valuable and leaves the rest. They do not spend hundreds of hours folding clothes by color and lining up toothbrushes in an unmapped mountain cavern. The cave of luggage was not a storehouse, it was a psychological installation. The most disturbing possibility was that the pilot and passengers survived the initial crash and lived for a period of time in the cave. This would mean that after the terror of the storm, they managed to salvage their luggage and trek 50 miles through the frozen wilderness. But once they reached the safety of the cave, they didn't build a fire or try to signal for help. Instead, they spent their remaining strength and their final days meticulously unpacking and sorting their suitcases before simply walking out of the cave and into the ice, leaving no tracks behind. I have looked at the photographs of that cave and felt the absolute, sterile intention of the arrangement. It is an order that feels more terrifying than any scene of violence, because it suggests a total surrender to a logic we cannot understand. The things we pack for a trip are the fragments of our identity. And in that cave, those fragments were being treated as pieces of a puzzle that had no solution. The sorting was not an act of hope, it was an act of deletion, a way of turning people into a list of stacked attributes. The wreckage of the Cessna and the bodies of the 6 people have never been found, despite numerous expeditions into the region over the last 30 years. The cave of luggage remains the only physical evidence that Flight 420 ever existed. The suitcases and their contents were eventually returned to the families, but many of them refused to take the items back. They could not look at the neatly folded clothes without seeing the invisible hands that had handled them in the dark. The belongings were eventually donated or destroyed, their secrets remaining buried in the silt of the cave. 2026 finds the Mount Fitzroy region as a destination for thousands of hikers and climbers every year, most of whom are unaware of the anomaly in the ice. The cave itself has been sealed by a series of small avalanches, its entrance hidden once again by the shifting glaciers. The Argentine aviation files list the case as unsolved, a mystery of staging and logistics that defies every known rule of mountain survival. The flight of Julian and his passengers ended not in a scream of metal, but in a silent, colorful arrangement of shirts and journals 50 miles from where they were supposed to be. The story of the Patagonian cave is a reminder that the wilderness does not just take our lives, it can take our very understanding of reality. It is a story of how the human need for order can manifest in the most surreal and chilling ways when the world falls apart. As the wind howls over the jagged peaks of the Fitzroy, we move toward the warm, humid air of the South Pacific. It is a place where a different kind of disappearance is unfolding, and the sand is as smooth as if the people who walked upon it were never there at all. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in September 1996, a local trader named David was steering his small, wooden supply boat through the turquoise shallows of Viti Levu. He navigated the jagged coral of the reef with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years reading the subtle shifts in the water's color. The air was thick with the scent of brine and the heavy, floral perfume of the coastal jungle that pressed right up to the white sand. David was headed toward a small, private cove where a communal group called the Children of the Reef had established a modest settlement 6 months earlier. The group was led by a man in his late 50s named Elias, a former commercial diver who had spent decades working the deep pipelines of the Pacific. He was a man of quiet, intense presence, with eyes that seemed fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. Elias had gathered 8 others, including 2 young couples and 3 children, to live a life of absolute simplicity away from the noise of Suva. They were not recluses, but people who believed that the modern world had lost its connection to the fundamental rhythms of the earth and the sea. The Children of the Reef spent their days in a state of shared, focused labor, maintaining 3 communal huts built from bamboo and palm thatch. They rose before the sun, walking down to the shoreline to perform a ritual that Elias had designed himself. They used long, wooden rakes to smooth the sand around the settlement, creating a clean, unblemished canvas that symbolized a fresh start for the soul every morning. This practice was mandatory, a meditative movement that ensured the ground they walked upon was always free of the debris and the footprints of the day before. Among the group was a young woman named Leilani, who had brought her 7-year-old son, Kaito, to live in the settlement. Leilani was a gifted gardener who had managed to coax a lush variety of taro, sweet potatoes, and tropical fruits from the thin, sandy soil behind the huts. She was a mother who valued the silence of the cove, believing that Kaito would grow up stronger and more perceptive without the distractions of the city. She would often sit on the beach in the evenings, teaching the boy the names of the constellations and the specific sounds of the different tides hitting the reef. Kaito was a child of the water, a boy who could swim before he could properly run, and who found more joy in the tidal pools than in any toy. He spent his mornings helping the adults with the raking, his small, careful strokes mimicking the deliberate movements of Elias. The boy was the heart of the settlement, a reminder of the future they were trying to build through their shared devotion to the sea. He would often bring small, colorful shells to the communal kitchen, placing them on the table as decorations for their evening meals. The other members included a young couple, Mara and Tevita, who were in charge of the group's only motorized boat. They were expert fishers who provided the primary source of protein for the community, spending hours on the open water beyond the reef. Tevita was a man of immense physical strength, while Mara had a natural instinct for the movements of the schools of tuna and snapper. They lived in a state of harmonious partnership, their lives defined by the pull of the currents and the shifting winds of the South Pacific. Every evening, the group would gather in the communal kitchen, a large, open-air structure that smelled of wood smoke and fresh coconut milk. They would share a meal of grilled fish and steamed taro, listening to a local news broadcast on a small, battery-powered radio. This was their only link to the outside world, a way to stay informed without becoming entangled in the chaos they had left behind. They were a community of trust, a small family of choice that believed they had found a permanent sanctuary at the edge of the world. Elias believed that the sea was not just a resource, but a living, breathing entity that demanded respect and a certain level of spiritual alignment. He would often lead the group in long, silent walks along the reef at low tide, pointing out the intricate beauty of the coral and the life it supported. He spoke of an underwater kingdom, a place of absolute peace where the weight of the world could be surrendered to the pressure of the depths. The group listened with a quiet, unblinking intensity, drawn to his vision of a life that was deeper and more meaningful than the one they had known. The children of the reef were known to the local traders like David as a peaceful and reliable group who traded fresh produce for fuel and dry goods. David enjoyed his visits to the cove, finding a sense of calm in the orderly, clean-swept sand and the polite, gentle greetings of the members. He respected their desire for isolation, noting how they seemed to have found a balance that few others could maintain. To David, the settlement was a small island of sanity in a world that was becoming increasingly frantic and unpredictable. Leilani had recently started a small journal, recording the growth of her plants and the observations Kaido made about the marine life in the cove. She wrote about the way the light changed during the hurricane season and the feeling of the soft, raked sand beneath her bare feet in the morning. She felt a deep sense of security, believing that as long as they remained true to the rituals of Elias, the reef would protect them. Her life was a collection of quiet joys and steady, purposeful work, a trajectory that felt as certain as the rising of the moon. Elias maintained a separate hut where he kept his diving gear and a collection of charts showing the deep water trenches off the coast of Viti Levu. He was a man who still felt the pull of the deep, often spending hours alone in the water, watching the way the light filtered down into the blue. He believed that the settlement was just the beginning of a larger journey, a transition toward a state of existence that was entirely fluid and free. This sense of expectation was shared by the group, a subtle, electric tension that sat beneath the calm surface of their daily lives. I have spent a long time thinking about the silence of a place where 9 people are supposed to be living. This companion voice is a reminder that the quiet we find in nature is usually filled with the sounds of life, the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves, or the voices of children. When that silence becomes absolute, when it feels like the air itself is holding its breath, it is a signal that the rules of the world have been temporarily suspended. The children of the reef lived in that silence, never suspecting that it would one day become the only thing left of their presence in the cove. On the afternoon, David arrived with his supplies. He noticed the unusual event before his boat even touched the sand. The settlement was bathed in the harsh, flat light of the 3 o'clock sun, but there was no movement on the beach and no sound of the children playing. The main gate to the property, a simple bamboo structure that was always kept closed to keep out the wild pigs, was standing wide open. David cut the engine and let his boat drift toward the shore. The only sound, the gentle lapping of the water against the hull and the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves on the outer reef. He stepped off the boat and onto the white sand, expecting to see Elias or Tavita walking down to help him with the crates of fuel and grain. But the beach was empty, and the silence of the jungle behind the huts felt heavy and suffocating. David walked toward the communal kitchen, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the shells that lay near the waterline. He felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease, a sense that he was trespassing in a space that had been abandoned in a moment of extreme, inexplicable haste. David reached the edge of the settlement and stopped, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of the bamboo huts. The sand, which was always raked into a smooth, unblemished surface every morning, was perfectly clean and undisturbed. There were no footprints leading toward the huts, and no tracks leading away toward the jungle or the sea. It was as if the ground had been swept clean and then never stepped on again, a canvas that held no record of the people who lived there. David felt a wave of confusion wash over him, as he knew the group never left the sand unraked. He entered the communal kitchen and found a scene that turned his confusion into a sharp, visceral dread. On the long wooden table were 9 plates of fresh fish and steaming taro, the scent of the food still hot and appetizing in the heavy, humid air. A small, battery-powered radio was playing a local news broadcast. The voice of the announcer, a strange, buzzing intrusion into the absolute silence of the room. The chairs were pulled back as if the group had just stood up to greet a visitor, but there were no signs of a struggle and no evidence of a sudden flight. David walked through the 3 sleeping huts, finding the beds neatly made and the personal belongings of the members still in their places. Leilani's gardening tools were leaning against the wall, and Kaito's collection of shells was still arranged on a small shelf near his mat. There was no blood, no torn clothing, and no signs that anything had been taken from the settlement. The group's only motorized boat was still tied to the small pier, bobbing gently in the tide as if waiting for Tavita and Mara to return for another run beyond the reef. David ran back to his boat and pushed off into the shallows, his heart hammering against his ribs as he steered back toward the main harbor at Suva. He contacted the Fijian police, and within 3 hours, a search party had been dispatched to the cove, including a team of forensic investigators and Navy divers. They moved through the settlement with a clinical, unblinking intensity, documenting the food on the table and the undisturbed sand. They searched the jungle for 5 kilometers in every direction, but they found no tracks, no discarded items, and no signs of the 9 missing people. The investigation focused on the impossibility of 9 people, including 3 children, vanishing from a settlement surrounded by soft, raked sand without leaving a single footprint. You are standing in a kitchen where the steam is still rising from a plate of fish, and you look out at a beach that is as smooth as a mirror. There is no way for 9 people to reach the water or the trees without marking the ground. Yet the ground is empty. It is a mystery of logistics and physics, a disappearance that seems to have happened vertically rather than horizontally. Navy divers spent 3 days scouring the reef and the deep water trenches beyond the cove, looking for bodies or evidence of a mass drowning. They found nothing but the colorful coral and the steady, indifferent movement of the fish. There were no signs of a boat accident, and the water was clear and calm, with no reports of sudden squalls or unusual currents on the day the group vanished. The children of the reef had been deleted from the earth in the time it took for a meal to be served and the radio to play a single news segment. Neighbors from a small village 2 kilometers down the coast reported seeing strange, pulsing lights hovering over the reef on the night before David's arrival. They described the lights as a deep, vibrant blue that seemed to move with a rhythmic, intelligent purpose before disappearing into the water. The police initially dismissed these reports as local superstition, but as the investigation hit a stone wall, they began to record the sightings with a new level of seriousness. However, no physical evidence of the lights or any atmospheric anomaly was ever found in the region. The twist in the case came when a detective searched Elias's private hut and found a small, leather-bound notebook tucked into the hollow of a bamboo pillar. Most of the pages were filled with coordinates and observations about the tides, but the final entry was dated the morning of the disappearance. In a hand that was steady and calm, Elias had written a single, cryptic sentence: "The tide is rising inside us, and the blue is finally calling for the return." There was no explanation, no farewell, and no indication that the group was in any danger or planning to leave. The discovery of the notebook suggested a collective, ritualistic act, but it offered no answer as to how the group had executed their departure without leaving a mark on the sand. The police considered the theory of a mass, voluntary drowning, where the group had walked backward into the water while raking their tracks behind them. But this would have been an incredibly difficult task to perform with 3 young children, and it didn't explain why the boat was left tied to the dock or why the food was left steaming on the table. The timing was too precise, the exit too clean. The climax of the investigation was the realization that 9 human beings had been removed from a closed system without a single witness or a single shred of forensic evidence. The silence of the cove became a haunting presence in the national media, a story of a maritime land hybrid mystery that defied every rational explanation. Theories ranged from a highly coordinated abduction by a third party to a spontaneous, metaphysical event that had lifted the group directly from the earth. But without bodies and without tracks, the police were left with a collection of empty huts and a table of cold food. The explanation of what really happened to the children of the reef remains a void in the criminal and maritime records of Fiji. Some believe that Elias led the group into a suicide pact, convinced that they were transitioning into the underwater kingdom he had always spoken about. Others suggest that the strange lights were a real, physical phenomenon that played a role in the group's disappearance. But the lack of struggle and the presence of the hot meal suggest that whatever happened, it was a sudden, perhaps even welcomed, event that occurred in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The case was eventually classified as an unsolved mass disappearance, one of the most famous and unsettling cold cases in the history of the South Pacific. The children of the reef became ghosts of the coastline, their names whispered in the tea houses of Suva and the fishing villages of Viti Levu. The settlement was left abandoned, the bamboo huts slowly rotting in the humid air and the gardens being swallowed by the aggressive growth of the jungle. The white sand was no longer raked every morning, and the smooth canvas was quickly filled with the tracks of crabs and the debris of the tides. I have stood on beaches where the sand was so perfect it felt wrong to step on it, and I understood for a second the obsession of the children. The order they sought was a way to make their lives mean something in the face of the vast, indifferent sea. But the tide is a powerful thing, and it usually leaves a mark when it takes something back. In the case of the cove, the only mark it left was the absolute absence of one, a silence that is louder than any scream. The 9 are gone, and the reef remains, a blue and jagged witness to a story that has no end. 2026 finds the cove as a place of thick, impenetrable mangroves and silent, sun-bleached ruins. The compound has been completely reclaimed by the nature it once tried to mirror. The bamboo long since turned to dust, and the taro gardens lost to the salt. The file on the children of the reef remains open in the Suva police headquarters, a stack of yellowed papers that offer no new leads and no closure for the families left behind. The cove is avoided by local fishers, who claim that the sound of a radio can still be heard drifting over the water on quiet afternoons. The mystery of the unblemished sand is a reminder that there are gaps in our understanding of the world that even the most meticulous investigation cannot bridge. It is a story of how a group of people can seek a different reality for a few moments, perhaps actually find it. As the humid air of Fiji settles over the empty ruins, we move toward the blinding white salt pans of the Australian outback. It is a place where the silence is even deeper, and 3 men are walking a straight line into a void that will never give them back. In July of 1996, the Australian outback was a vast, freezing ocean of red dust and absolute silence. David, a 38-year-old telecommunications engineer with a face lined by the desert sun, sat in the cab of his heavy-duty Land Cruiser. He was currently checking the frequency on a handheld radio, his fingers moving with the casual certainty of a man who had spent 15 years working in the dead heart of the Northern Territory. The night air was biting, and the only light came from the dim, green glow of the dashboard and the endless, cold stars above. David lived in a small, tidy house on the edge of Alice Springs, where the backyard was a collection of salvaged radio parts and half-finished solar projects. He was a father of 2 young girls who believed their dad was a kind of magician who could pull voices out of the empty air. Every morning, he would make them breakfast before packing his gear for the long hauls into the deep desert. David was not a man of many words, but he possessed a deep, quiet reliability that made him the leader of the Outpost repair teams. Mark, the youngest of the trio at 25, was an expert in microwave relay systems who had moved from Sydney for the adventure of the outback. He had a quick, restless energy and a habit of whistling when he was deep in thought. Chris, the third member, was 45 and had been a bush mechanic before transitioning into telecommunications. He was the one who could fix a broken axle with a piece of wire and a prayer. A man who knew the desert was not an enemy, but a neighbor that demanded respect. The team had been dispatched to Tower 72, a remote relay station 400 kilometers north of Alice Springs. It was a routine job, intended to fix a minor signal degradation that had been reported by the long-range military monitors. The drive would take them deep into the Tanami Desert, a place where the horizon is a flat, shimmering line, and the sky feels like it is pressing down on the roof of the truck. They carried enough water for 2 weeks and an emergency beacon that could signal a satellite in seconds. David took a certain pride in the isolation of his work, finding a sense of peace in the absolute solitude of the Australian interior. He enjoyed the rhythm of the long drives, the way the red sand gave way to rocky plateaus and then to the blinding white of the ancient salt pans. He would often record small voice memos for his daughters, describing the animals he saw or the way the sunset turned the world into a landscape of fire. David was a man who felt a profound connection to the emptiness, believing that the silence held a clarity that the city could never offer. The trio functioned like a well-oiled machine, their movements synchronized by years of working in high-stakes, remote environments. They spent their lunch breaks sitting on the tailgate of the Land Cruiser, sharing tinned fruit and talking about the sports scores they had missed. Mark would talk about the music scene in the city, while Chris would tell stories about the old cattle stations that used to dot the region. They were more than co-workers. They were a brotherhood of the wire, tied together by the shared responsibility of keeping the outposts connected. David's wife, Sarah, was a woman who understood the silence of the desert as well as he did. She knew that when David went out on a job, he was entering a world where the margin for error was non-existent. She would always pack a small handwritten note in his toolkit, reminding him of the dinner they would have when he returned. David kept these notes in his breast pocket, a physical anchor to the life that waited for him beyond the red horizon. He was a man who was deeply loved, and he carried that love into the furthest reaches of the wasteland. The engineers reached the base of Tower 72 just as the sun was beginning to dip below the western rim of the world. The tower was a skeletal, steel needle rising 60 meters into the air, surrounded by a chain-link fence that was half buried in the shifting dunes. David climbed out of the truck, the desert wind tugging at his heavy canvas jacket and the scent of dry spinifex filling his lungs. He looked up at the microwave dishes, their white surfaces reflecting the dying light like the eyes of some ancient, unblinking bird. They set up their camp with a mechanical efficiency, unloading the generators and the heavy diagnostic equipment from the rear of the vehicle. Mark began to calibrate the ground-level receivers, while Chris started a small portable stove to heat their coffee. David stood by the truck, looking out toward a massive, blindingly white salt pan that stretched for miles to the east. The surface of the pan was as flat and hard as a concrete floor, a landscape devoid of vegetation or life, glowing with a ghostly, pale light in the twilight. I have noticed that in the deep desert, the things we build to communicate often highlight just how truly alone we are. David watched the static on the monitor, a thin, flickering line of green that represented the pulse of the tower. He was a man who lived by the signals, the invisible threads that connected the lonely outposts to the rest of humanity. To David, the static was not an absence of information, but a presence of something vast and unorganized that lived in the gaps between the stations. He felt a moment of deep, professional contentment as the generator hummed into life. The unusual event happened at 11:14 that night. While the team was finishing the final tests on the primary microwave dish, you are sitting in the cab of a truck, and the only sound is the low, steady vibration of the idling diesel engine. Suddenly, the radio on the dashboard begins to drift away from the station you were monitoring, the music replaced by a deep, resonant hum. It is a sound that vibrates in your chest and through the steering wheel, a low-frequency broadcast that does not belong to any known human frequency. The air outside feels thick and electric, making the fine hairs on your arms stand perfectly upright. The truck's engine was still running, its headlights cutting 2 bright paths into the darkness. But the trio was nowhere to be seen. The doors of the Land Cruiser were standing wide open, and David's toolkit was scattered at the foot of the tower as if a job had been interrupted mid-sentence. A half-full cup of coffee sat on the hood, still radiating a faint warmth into the freezing desert air. The emergency beacon, the one thing they were trained to trigger at the first sign of trouble. remained untouched in its orange protective casing on the dashboard. The discovery occurred 3 days later when a search plane from Alice Springs spotted the silver Land Cruiser at the base of the tower. A ground recovery team was dispatched by helicopter, and they found the vehicle exactly as it had been left on the night of the signal spike. The engine had eventually run out of fuel and died, but the radio was still switched on, though the batteries were now flat. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no evidence that anyone had tried to use the survival gear packed in the back of the truck. The search team found the first set of tracks, leading away from the truck and toward the edge of the massive salt pan. The footprints were crisp and clear in the red sand, showing 3 distinct sets of boots moving in a perfectly straight line. David, Mark, and Chris had walked side by side, their strides rhythmic and steady, as if they were following a path that only they could see. There were no signs of hesitation, no circular patterns of confusion, and no tracks suggesting that any of the men had turned back to look at the vehicle. As the tracks moved onto the hard, baked surface of the salt pan, the investigators struggled to follow them. The ground was as solid as stone, but the fine, white dust of the pan had captured the faint outlines of the heavy work boots. The searchers tracked the engineers for 2 kilometers, moving further and further into the blinding white center of the dry lake. The air was perfectly still, and the heat began to rise from the ground in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon in every direction. The 3 men had walked into the dead heart of the pan without a single bottle of water between them. Then, at a point exactly in the center of the salt pan, the tracks simply stopped. There were no return prints, no signs that the men had collapsed, and no evidence of a struggle or a landing site for another vehicle. The last few footprints were as deep and clear as the first, showing that the men were still standing upright and moving forward with purpose. It was as if they had reached a specific coordinate and then been lifted vertically into the air, leaving the vast, white expanse of the salt completely undisturbed beyond that point. The investigation revealed that the microwave relay tower had recorded a massive electromagnetic spike at 11:14 p.m. on the night the men vanished. This spike was followed by a data log entry that showed the tower's primary dish had rotated away from its intended target and locked onto a point in the empty sky. The radio in the truck had been tuned to a frequency that was broadcasting nothing but that steady, low-frequency hum. It was a technical anomaly that had no rational explanation in the logs of the Australian telecommunications network, a signal from nowhere that had reached into the desert. Searchers used ground-penetrating radar and heavy excavation equipment to check for hidden sinkholes or underground caverns beneath the salt. They found nothing but solid, ancient layers of mineral and stone that had not been disturbed for thousands of years. The footprints remained the only evidence of their passage. 3 lines of human intention that ended in a total, physical void. The police interviewed every station owner and pilot in a 500-kilometer radius, but no one had seen a light or heard a sound on the night the engineers walked away from their life-saving truck. I have wondered if the signal they heard was not a noise, but a command that the human brain was not equipped to refuse. This reflection is a cold weight, a realization that we are only as secure as the information we can understand. David and his team were men of the wire, people who spent their lives interpreting the invisible world, and they may have finally found a frequency that spoke directly to the core of their being. They walked into the white not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming necessity that erased the need for water, for air, or for home. The twist in the case came when a forensic tech analyzed the radio frequency recorded in the truck's memory bank. The frequency did not correspond to any satellite, any military outpost, or any civilian broadcast in the southern hemisphere. It was a ghost frequency, a part of the spectrum that is usually reserved for deep space observation. Yet it had been broadcast with enough power to overwhelm a heavy-duty industrial receiver. The hum was not a random noise, it was a structured, repeating pattern of pulses that mirrored the rhythmic beating of a human heart. The climax of the search was the moment the recovery team stood at the end of the tracks, looking up into the clear, blue sky of the Northern Territory. There was nothing above them but the sun, and nothing around them but the white, silent salt that stretched to the edge of the world. They felt the absolute isolation of the dead heart, a place where the rules of the city and the logic of the laboratory simply ceased to function. The Outpost trio had not been lost to the desert. They had been claimed by a force that left no footprints and took no luggage. The explanation of what really happened to David, Mark, and Chris remains an unsolved technical and human mystery. The telecommunications company eventually replaced the equipment at Tower 72 and erased the strange data logs from the primary server. They officially classified the disappearance as a misadventure due to extreme environmental conditions, despite the lack of any supporting physical evidence. To the world of logistics and liability, it was easier to blame the heat than to acknowledge a signal that could pull men out of their own lives. The legal outcome was a series of closed-door hearings and a settlement for the families that came with a strict non-disclosure agreement. David's wife, Sarah, refused to sign at first, demanding to know why her husband would walk away from a note in his pocket and a daughter's breakfast. But she eventually realized that the desert was not going to give back what it had taken, and the truth was a frequency that she could not hear. She kept the Land Cruiser's radio in her home, sometimes turning it on late at night to listen to the static, hoping for a whisper of the man she had lost. 2026 finds the relay tower still standing in the Tanami Desert, its white dishes hummed by the wind and the grit of the red sand. The mystery of the silent broadcast has become a staple of outback lore, a story told by travelers who pass through the remote outposts of the Dead Heart. The footprints in the salt have long since been erased by the shifting winds and the rare desert rains, but the coordinate where they ended is still marked on the maps of the local search and rescue teams. The 3 engineers remain missing, their names a part of the vast, unrecorded history of the Australian interior. David's daughters are now women themselves, and they still look at the night sky over Alice Springs with a sense of quiet, lingering wonder. They remember their father as a man who could hear the invisible, and they wonder if he is still out there, moving through a landscape that has no need for roads or wires. The Outpost trio is a reminder that even in our connected world, there are places where the signals are not our own. They are the ghosts of the frequency, a part of the silence that lives in the gaps between the stations, waiting for the next ear to listen. The silent broadcast is a story of how the very tools we use to conquer the distance can sometimes lead us into a void we cannot cross. It is a reminder that the desert is a place of absolute, unblinking clarity that can strip away the layers of civilization in a single, electric moment. As the hum of the outback radio fades into the freezing night, we move toward the high-security borders of the Forbidden Zone. It is a place where a man is leaving his wealth in the dust, his clothes lying empty in the sand like a skin that has been shed by a creature moving toward the stars. On a Tuesday morning in November, 1996, a dry, scorching wind blew across the Sperrgebiet, the forbidden diamond territory of the Namib Desert. Dr. Eliasve, a 41-year-old chief geologist, adjusted his tinted goggles and looked out over the endless, shimmering dunes of Sector 4. He reached into the back of his white 4x4 to grab a soil sampling kit, his movements slow and practiced to conserve energy in the 100-degree heat. The desert here was a restricted wasteland, a closed system guarded by radar, armed patrols, and hundreds of miles of electrified fencing. Elias was a man who lived by the rigid laws of geology and the even stricter protocols of the mining conglomerate that employed him. He was a scientist of high standing, respected for his ability to read the ancient history of the earth through the subtle shifts in sand and stone. His life was built on a foundation of data, a man who preferred the company of mineral deposits and seismic charts to the noise of the city. He lived in a company-provided house on the edge of the zone, where his shelves were lined with leather-bound field journals and jars of sorted earth. Every morning, Elias would kiss his wife goodbye and drive into the most secure landscape on the planet, a place where the dirt beneath his tires was worth billions of dollars. He was a man of absolute integrity, trusted with access to the deepest and most valuable veins of the Namibian desert. Elias found a profound sense of peace in the isolation of the Forbidden Zone, enjoying the way the silence of the dunes swallowed the sound of his engine. He was not a man who sought wealth, but a man who sought the truth of how the earth had hidden its treasures millions of years ago. He was a meticulous record keeper, noting every change in wind direction and every fluctuation in the temperature of the salt pans. In his free time, he would sit on his porch in the evening, sketching the way the light hit the rock formations of the distant mountains. Elias had a quiet, dry wit and a deep love for his young son, whom he was teaching to identify the constellations of the southern sky. He saw his work not as a job, but as a long-term conversation with the physical world, a dialogue conducted in the language of pressure and time. His colleagues knew him as the man who never missed a radio check and never arrived a minute late for a briefing. He moved through the high-security checkpoints with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide, his ID badge always clipped perfectly to his breast pocket. Elias was the person the company called when a new sector needed to be surveyed, relying on his legendary stamina and his unerring sense of direction. He was a pillar of the mining community, a man who represented the absolute intersection of scientific excellence and corporate trust. Elias often spoke about the desert as if it were a living creature, one that required respect and a constant awareness of its dangers. He carried enough water and emergency supplies to survive a week in the dunes, and his vehicle was equipped with the latest satellite tracking technology. He was a man who planned for every contingency, believing that the only way to survive the Namib was to be more disciplined than the landscape itself. This dedication to safety was his defining trait, a professional shield that he wore every day of his 19-year career. He had spent the last several months focused on Sector 4, a vast, blindingly white salt pan that had remained untouched by commercial mining for decades. Elias believed that the pan held a secret about the movement of prehistoric rivers that had carried diamonds from the interior to the coast. He approached the survey with a feverish intellectual curiosity, spending long hours walking the perimeter of the pan with his mapping tools. To Elias, the salt pan was not a wasteland, but a massive, unread page of history that he was determined to translate. On the day he vanished, he had signed out at the main security gate at 6 o'clock in the morning, his vehicle log showing a planned route to the edge of the salt pan. He spoke briefly with the guard, a man he had known for a decade, and mentioned that he hoped to find evidence of a specific quartz vein. He was seen on the long-range security cameras at 7:15, his white truck a tiny, steady dot moving across the flat, red horizon. Elias was doing exactly what he had done for thousands of days, a man in motion toward a goal he had defined with scientific precision. The first off-key detail appeared at 10 o'clock when the security dispatcher realized that Elias had missed his scheduled radio check-in. This was a violation of protocol that was unheard of for a man of his habits, and the dispatcher immediately tried to contact him on the emergency frequency. There was no answer, only the steady, rhythmic hiss of atmospheric static that characterized the deep desert. The dispatcher waited for 15 minutes, his hand hovering over the alarm, before signaling the corporate recovery team that a senior employee was unresponsive in the field. A heavily armed security team was dispatched by helicopter. Following the GPS coordinates of the 4x4's last known position, they found the vehicle parked on the edge of the salt pan, looking perfectly normal in the harsh, midday sun. The engine was off, the doors were closed, and there were no signs of mechanical failure or a sudden accident. Elias's mapping tools were sitting on the passenger seat, and his half-finished bottle of water was still tucked into the center console. The truck was a small island of order in the middle of a vast, unmoving sea of white salt. The recovery team moved 50 meters away from the vehicle, their boots crunching on the hard, baked surface of the pan, and discovered something that defied every rule of the Forbidden Zone. Resting on the ground, laid out with clinical, obsessive care, was Elias's protective sunsuit, his heavy leather boots, and his tinted goggles. The clothes were not scattered as if they had been torn off in a struggle. They were arranged as if a man had simply evaporated out of them while standing still. The boots were placed perfectly upright, and the sleeves of the suit were folded across the chest in a gesture of absolute, frozen repose. Surrounding the empty clothes was a large, intricate spiral made entirely of high-grade, unpolished rough diamonds. There were thousands of them, ranging in size from small grains to stones as large as a man's thumb, their surfaces catching the light with a dull, oily sheen. The value of the diamonds in the spiral was estimated to be in the millions of dollars, a fortune left sitting in the dirt of the salt pan. It was not a stash or a smuggler's drop. It was a geometric arrangement of wealth that had been constructed with the same precision Elias used for his maps. Corporate security investigators and forensic experts arrived within the hour, sealing off the sector and turning the salt pan into a high-stakes crime scene. They found no footprints leading away from the empty clothes, and the trackers could find no scent for the dogs to follow beyond the immediate area of the truck. The radar logs from the perimeter fence showed no incoming or outgoing aircraft, and the motion sensors at the gate had not been triggered. It was a locked room mystery on a desert scale, a disappearance from a closed system that was designed to be impenetrable. The investigation took a surreal turn when the forensic team analyzed the diamonds used in the spiral. They were not from the surrounding soil of Sector 4, but were traced to a high-purity, deep-vein sector that was located over 200 miles away. More importantly, those specific stones had been stored in a high-security vault that had been sealed and monitored since 1995. Elias had not accessed that vault in over a year, yet the stones from the vault were now sitting in the salt, hundreds of miles from where they should have been locked away. You are standing on a salt pan where the sun is a physical weight on your neck, and the only thing moving is the heat rising from a pile of stones that could buy a small country. You look at the empty boots and the perfect spiral of diamonds, and you realize that the man who owned them did not run away. The sand around the clothes is as smooth as a fresh sheet of paper, showing no marks of a struggle and no return prints to the vehicle. He wondered if the diamonds were simply the Earth's way of keeping score, a final tally of a life spent digging for secrets. I have stood on the edge of places where the law of the land stops at the fence line, but the laws of nature are the only ones that really matter. The corporate investigators were forced to consider the theory of a total psychological break, suggesting that Elias had engaged in a complex, ritualistic suicide. They theorized that he had stolen the diamonds over a period of months and staged the scene before wandering off into the dunes to die of exposure. But even this did not explain the lack of footprints or how a man of his physical build could have moved 200 miles of distance without being detected. The most disturbing possibility was that Elias had discovered something in the deep desert that changed his understanding of the world he served. He was a man of logic who had been confronted with the absolute, raw power of the earth, and perhaps he had decided to return his knowledge to the source. The spiral was not a thief's treasure, but an offering, a way of balancing the scales before he disappeared into the heat. The diamonds were left in the dust because, in the end, they were just stones to a man who had finally seen behind the curtain of the physical world. The mining conglomerate eventually classified the disappearance of Dr. W.W. Eliasve as a workplace fatality due to extreme environmental conditions and psychological distress. They refused to release the details of the diamond spiral to the public, fearing a wave of treasure hunters would attempt to breach the forbidden zone. The file was sealed. The sector was closed to further exploration, and the story of the geologist who evaporated was buried under layers of corporate non-disclosure. The world was told that a good man had been lost to the heat, a simple explanation for an impossible event. 2026 finds the Sperrgebiet as a place where the technology of surveillance has reached a level of total, unblinking control. High-definition cameras and thermal sensors now monitor every inch of the salt pans, ensuring that no one can move through the zone without being recorded. but the file on Elias remains a ghost in the company's archives. A case that the newer investigators talk about in huzzard tones when the lights are low. The coordinates where the clothes were found are still marked on the internal maps. A point of absolute, unexplained emptiness in a landscape of greed. The family of Dr. Nell, Elias V, moved away from the mining town long ago, carrying with them the memory of a man who loved the stars and the stone. His son is now a man himself, and he still looks toward the Namib at sunset, wondering if his father is still out there, a part of the wind and the light. The diamonds were returned to the vault, their oily sheen no longer reflecting the sun of the salt pan. But the mystery they represented was never solved. The desert remains a witness to a story that has no footprints and no end. A silent partner in a closed system vanishing. The spiral in the dust is a story of how the things we value most can become meaningless when we are faced with the absolute isolation of the wild. It is a reminder that even the most secure borders are no match for a mind that has decided to leave the world behind. As the heat of the Namib desert settles into the cold of the night, we are left with the image of a pair of empty boots standing in the white. The man is gone, the diamonds are back in the dark, and the Sperrgebiet continues to guard its secrets with a heavy, golden silence. The rain is still tapping against the glass, and the white noise of the night has settled into the corners of the room. We have traveled across 13 different landscapes tonight, from the industrial graveyards of Germany to the blinding salt pans of the Australian interior. Each of these stories leaves a specific kind of chill behind, a weight that does not lift just because the narration has ended. It is the weight of realizing that the world we walk through every day is often held together by nothing more than the thin, fragile thread of our own assumptions. We assume that a locked door is a barrier, and that a clear path across the sand will show the footprints of anyone who crossed it. We assume that the people we trust to fix our pipes or heal our spirits are operating within the same moral framework that we are. But as we saw in the streets of Kyoto and the sugarcane fields of Sumatra, that framework can be dismantled by a mind that sees human life as a medium to be folded, buried, or upgraded. The precision of the paper man and the sorcerer reminds us that darkness does not always look like chaos. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the world is not the monster that screams, but the one that calculates. The chalk phantom in Pune and the artist of the Bosphorus did not strike in a frenzy of rage. They worked with the steady hands of architects and craftsmen. They took their time to draw perfect mandalas and carve intricate gemstone hands, treating the end of a human life as a mere technical requirement for their art. It is this cold, clinical approach to cruelty that stays with us, a reminder that obsession can be more lethal than any sudden impulse. In the case of Thomas S. and the Gravel Pit Whisperer, we saw how sound itself can be turned into a weapon of total isolation. Sensory deprivation is a form of violence that leaves no bruises. Yet it hollowed out a young man's mind in 40 days of absolute, high-frequency pressure. It is a reminder that our connection to reality is dependent on the signals we receive from the world around us. When those signals are replaced by a manufactured loop of noise, the very architecture of our identity begins to crumble, leaving behind a shell that can no longer recognize the sunlight. The cave of Luggage in Patagonia and the Sperrgebiet spiral in Namibia represent the ultimate anomalies of our modern era. They are cases where the physical evidence suggests a logic that is entirely alien to our understanding of survival. A man does not simply melt out of his sunsuit and leave millions of dollars in diamonds in a perfect spiral on the sand. A group of passengers does not vanish from a crash site only to have their clothes sorted by color in a mountain cave 50 miles away. These are the moments where the map of the real world simply ends. We live in a time of total surveillance, where every movement is tracked by a digital pulse and every secret is eventually harvested by a database. Yet, even in 2026, the Outpost trio and the children of the Reef remain ghosts of the 20th century. They are the ones who walked into the white noise and never came back, leaving us with empty plates of food and straight lines of footprints that lead to nowhere. They remind us that there are still gaps in the grid, places where the signals fail and the earth refuses to tell us where its people have gone. The lesson hidden in these stories is not one of paranoia, but of a deeper, more attentive awareness. We have seen that the most dangerous places are often the ones we consider the safest. From the high-security nurseries of Beihai to the thick stone walls of an apartment in Lyon, safety is a collective agreement, a fragile promise that we make to one another every time we check a lock or trust a neighbor. When that agreement is broken by someone with the patience to study the routine, the fortress becomes a cage before we even realize the gate has been opened. I have spent many nights looking at these files, and the one thing that remains consistent is the absolute ordinary nature of the victims. They were people with dinner plans, people with savings for a new roof, and people who stopped to help a stranger with a stalled car. They were not seeking tragedy. They were simply living their lives with the assumption that the world would be fair. Their stories are not just accounts of crime, but reminders of the profound dignity found in a simple, honest life, and the tragedy of how easily that life can be interrupted. The winter Terminator in Ukraine showed us that even in the most isolated villages, the darkness can move with a military efficiency that turns a home into a target. Anatoly Onoprienko did not just take lives. He took the sense of peace that a family feels when the snow begins to fall and the lights go out. He moved through the freezing forests like a shadow, proving that when the structures of society are in flux, a single, disciplined predator can terrorize an entire nation. The cross of blood he tried to draw was a map of human vulnerability that we still struggle to read. As we look back from the vantage point of 2026, many of these cases remain as cold as the day they were first recorded. The lapis lazuli hands still sit in their glass case in Istanbul, and the parents of the Red Sun children still wait for a DNA match that will bring their sons home. These are the loose threads of history, the stories that refuse to be neatly summarized or forgotten. They exist in the spaces between the headlines, a collection of echoes that continue to vibrate long after the initial impact has faded from the public memory. The staging of a crime scene is an act of communication, a way for a killer to speak to the world through the remains of their victims. The executioner's path in Zimbabwe was a gallery of thorns and identity cards, a mockery of the state and the people who traveled its roads. The killer was not just murdering men, he was asserting his authority over the landscape, turning a public highway into a private, ritualistic graveyard. It is a terrifying realization that someone can view the world as their personal stage, and the rest of us as the props for their performance. We often talk about the search for truth as if it were a physical destination, a place where all the questions are answered and the mystery is resolved. But in the deep desert of the Australian interior or the ice fields of Patagonia, the truth is often a frequency that we are simply not equipped to hear. The silent broadcast that pulled 3 men into the salt pan was a signal from a void that leaves no records and no reasons. Some truths are not meant to be found. They are meant to be felt in the sudden, dead silence of a radio that no longer plays. The House of 1,000 Eyes in France remains one of the most intimate violations of the human spirit ever recorded. Jacques did not just watch his tenants, he lived their lives through a screen, turning their most private moments into a series of data points. He proved that a home is only as secure as the person who holds the keys, and that the feeling of being watched is often the only defense we have against a predator who has mastered the art of the invisible. The floral wallpaper of those apartments held thousands of secrets that were never intended to be shared. As the rain slows to a steady drip against the ledge, the stories we have shared tonight begin to blend into a single, dark tapestry. It is a tapestry woven from the threads of isolation, ritual, and the terrifying potential of the human mind to find order in the most chaotic acts. We have seen how the industrial, the mystical, and the technical can all be used to mask a profound and calculated form of cruelty. These are the stories that stay with us when we turn out the lights, the ones that make us listen a little more closely to the house as it settles. The aftertaste of these cases is a cold realization that the people who vanished and the people who were taken were just like us. They were people who appreciated the silence of a morning or the warmth of a shared meal. Their absence is a hole in the fabric of the world that can never be fully repaired, even with the passage of decades. We honor them not by dwelling on the horror of their end, but by remembering the life that came before it. Every one of them was a human being with a story that deserved a much different conclusion than the one they were given. We are moving toward the end of our journey tonight, back into the world of light and noise, where the rules are supposed to make sense again. But as you walk through your own hallways and look out your own windows, remember the paper girl and the chalk phantom. Remember that the world is a place of infinite complexity, and that the shadows at the edge of the forest are sometimes closer than they appear. The stories are over for now, but the questions they raise are the ones that will keep us company in the long hours before the sun finally breaks the horizon. If you find yourself still awake, listening to the steady hum of the night, perhaps it is because some part of you recognizes the truth in these anomalies. We are all just travelers on a path that we hope is well lit and clearly marked. But when the light fails and the tracks stop in the center of the salt, the only thing we have left is the strength of our own character and the memory of the people we love. Hold on to those things with a grip that does not waver, because they are the only things that the darkness cannot truly take from us. The night is deep now, and the world outside is as quiet as the forbidden zone of Namibia. We have seen enough of the darkness for one night, and it is time to let the rain wash away the dust of the quarries and the salt of the pans. The files are being closed, the monitors are going dark, and the voices of the 95s are fading back into the static of history. Take a deep breath, feel the warmth of the room around you, and let the weight of the stories settle into a place where they can no longer cause you any harm. I want to thank you for sitting with me tonight, for listening to these 13 accounts of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. It is a privilege to share these spaces with you, to walk through the shadows and return to the light together. If you value these kinds of stories and the slow, rhythmic way they are told, I would appreciate it if you could leave a comment and let me know which of these cases resonated with you the most. Your thoughts are the bridge that connects these isolated stories back to the world of the living. As for the like button, remember the gravel pit whisperer and the way he used sound to build a cage. Treat that like button with the same quiet, firm precision, and then let it go. It is a small gesture, but it helps to keep this channel moving forward, ensuring that the stories of the lost and the staged continue to be heard. Subscribe if you haven't already, so that you are always ready when the next signal broadcast begins. We have many more landscapes to explore, and I would be honored to have you as a companion on the next leg of the journey. Check the locks one more time, and perhaps leave a small light on in the hallway if the silence feels a bit too heavy tonight. The world will be waiting for you in the morning, with all its predictable rules and its bright, clear colors. But for now, just listen to the rain and let the night take care of itself. There is peace in the stillness, provided you know exactly where you are and who is standing beside you in the dark. Sleep well, stay safe, and I will be waiting for you here when the next story is ready to be told. The final echo of the Sperrgebiet spiral is a reminder that we all leave something behind, whether it is a footprint in the sand or a story in the air. Make sure that what you leave behind is worth the space it takes up, and that the people who find it can recognize the heart that put it there. The night is yours now, and the darkness is just a place for the stars to shine. Good night, and remember to always look twice at the pattern in the dust before you decide that the ground is empty. Everything we have shared tonight is a part of a larger conversation about the limits of the human experience and the resilience of the human spirit. We are the witnesses to these lives, the ones who carry their names forward into 2026 and beyond. It is a responsibility that we should not take lightly, but one that we should carry with a sense of quiet, somber pride. The elite script of the night is coming to its final period, and the ink is finally beginning to dry on the page. Until the next time, keep the light burning and the radio tuned to the truth. The blue of the Bosphorus and the white of the outback are merging into the gray of the pre-dawn light. The journey is complete. The 13 are accounted for, and the silence is finally at rest. I have said all that needs to be said for now, and the rest is up to you and the way you choose to walk through the world tomorrow. Be kind to the strangers you meet, and never forget the value of a steaming plate of food on a table shared with the people you love. The most profound magic is the one we create for each other every single day. The audio is fading, the rain is a whisper, and the white noise is a steady, comforting pulse. We have made it back from the edge, and the world is still here, waiting for us to wake up and claim it once again. The stories of the staged and the hidden are a part of us now, a layer of protection against the indifference of the void. Take that strength with you into your dreams, and know that you are never truly alone as long as there is someone willing to tell your story in the dark. Good night, and stay watchful in the quiet hours.